Hollie McKay, thank you for coming on, subject matter expert. It is so awesome to have you on this. We go back a little ways now at this point. You've been a conflict reporter for years. We worked with each other at Coffee or Die for a little while there. And you've been all over the world. You've been everywhere from Sudan to Afghanistan to Ukraine, many, many other places. You've written multiple books. You were a correspondent at Fox News for a long time. You've written for a variety of different publications over the years, reporting from around the world. And gosh, I feel like I'm missing something. You have what am I missing? You've lived such a life.
Thank you. That's so kind. Thank you for that introduction.
We should probably just dive right into the juicy stuff here. I can go back a couple of years in our text messages and look at a message from you shortly after you woke up in, I forget where, somewhere in Afghanistan.
Mazar-e-Sharif, yeah.
Yeah, Mazar. Realizing that you went to bed and Afghanistan was still Afghanistan and Hamid Karzai was still the president and all these other things. And
Ghani.
Oh, that was Ghani at that time, yes. And you woke up and the Taliban was in control and you were far from anywhere. Can you take me back?
Yeah, so I was in Afghanistan in 2021. Oh my gosh, time flies. I was there with a photographer friend of mine, Jake, who is also Australian, and we'd agreed to go back in that summer. And I felt that it was really going to be an important story because that was going to be sort of the end of this 20-year war and that the US was going to leave. And it was funny because I had sort of pitched this story as being important to different places and had just recently left a long career at Fox. And there really wasn't a lot of interest, so let me put it that way. And which blew my mind because I thought, this is a big story. And yet it felt like there just wasn't any interest. And I guess news editors at that point just assumed that the US was going to get in a helicopter and leave and the Afghans were going to take over and that was going to be the story. But it certainly felt to me like that wasn't going to be the case. I didn't expect things to transpire as quickly as they did, but I certainly figured it wasn't going to be a smooth.
There's a lot of people in the government that would agree with you.
Yes,
didn't see it happening that fast.
But it started to feel quite inevitable in that summer. So anyway, we go back, we're traveling. I remember going past these bases. This is about a week before the fall and just seeing soldiers walking home with their weapon and
Afghan soldiers?
Yeah, or some of them, left their weapon and walked home. And I remember talking to them and asking, where are you going? And they said, well, we're leaving. We're done. So-and-so, our leader left
Mm-hmm.
And to me that just, it felt very shocking. And so anyway, each day, you're talking to different officials who were all swearing by the fact that Afghanistan wasn't going to fall and all these brave leaders were going to, continue this fight. But it was just very apparent that the Taliban were taking province after province. And at that point, and as someone whose home that I'd been to before in Ankara, and that was Dostum. And of course, his area, being an Uzbek, is the north in Mazar. And he invited me to go and kind of embed with him and his troops. And again, to sort of show what this fight was about and how the Afghans were going to continue fighting. And so I went to Mazar. And we had a flight, and it was only supposed to be sort of a few days trip, I think 4 or 5 days. And we had a flight back, I remember it, for the Sunday. And I think we got up there maybe on the Wednesday. And just day by day, you could start to feel the first day, so much energy, the markets are filled, everybody's doing their thing and things felt very jubilant. But I remember kind of walking around thinking how strange it was that I didn't see a single soldier or policeman, or I didn't hear a single helicopter overhead. And yet all the provinces around Mazar, Kunduz, etc., had all already just fallen and people were fleeing to Mazar. And I just remember thinking it was strange. It felt like the Wild West, and not how you think a province that was on the verge of being taken over, because everything around it, that is what happened. And this just felt like it was completely abandoned.
And you knew kind of what to look for. This wasn't your first time in a war zone. This wasn't your first time in the middle of a collapse of a government.
Yeah.
You've been around a little bit at this point.
And so sort of at the beginning, there was a certain sense of surety, maybe on that first day or two. And then as the days progressed, it just started to feel more somber, and people were the attitude was changing. People were trying to get to Kabul. And then the morning, so then we hit Friday, and that Friday night I went out with sort of a special forces commando group, Afghan soldiers, and they were quite in the thick of fighting. And again, they were very patriotic, very, people that I think very, very committed to the fight, unlike, the soldiers I'd seen kind of walking away. And we sort of stayed with them till about 2 or 3 in the morning, and I just sort of remember them sort of talking. They didn't want us to leave, but they were so sure that, they swore up and down that Afghanistan was never going to fall, and they're certainly not their area. And Dostum kept pushing our meeting back and back and back. And Saturday morning, I woke up with very little sleep, and I remember kind of just bursting into tears for no reason when I woke up. And again, it goes back to my theory of the body never lies. Sometimes your body knows things before you do, of like preparing you for something that's going to happen that you don't know what. And I remember that morning, and it was just so eerie because, we went out and people were just lining up around the block, around their bank, to get money out of the bank, to withdraw whatever they had. I remember people fleeing, like seeing just tuk-tuks of people fleeing into the city with, the bags of whatever they could bring, because they were fleeing the outskirts where the fighting just appeared to be getting closer and closer. And I remember we sort of were trying to call different interpreters or different fixers in that area to take us places, and everybody had left. Everyone had gone to Kabul or was trying to get away. And we ended up, finally being put in touch with a random person who was driving us somewhere, and then he sort of stopped at one point and got a call on his flip phone, and he sort of turned around and looked at us and said, the fighting is basically a mile from here, and we can't go any further. And of course, we didn't want to put him in any kind of precarious situation, so we sort of said okay. And then I'm making calls to, again, the Afghan intelligence people that I knew in Kabul, who were still at that point saying Mazar is not going to fall, at least not immediately, at least not for many days. And at that point, what was really going on was that Taliban had surrounded the city. Dostum had actually fled to Uzbekistan, and the commandos that we'd been with the night before, I was messaging with them, and they were sort of saying how many of them had died, and the ones that were left, again, were all trying to line up to get out. And basically that was sort of done. And again, I was hearing so many mixed messages from, again, Kabul to what was happening on the ground to sort of what you're seeing on social media. So it kind of felt very strange because you're in this bubble where you're not really sure what to believe, but you're trying to stay calm and figure it out. And so we kind of went out to get something to eat. It was a Saturday, and I just remember there was nobody around. And this is a city that's usually really bustling. Nobody was around. And this little restaurant we went to, which normally, had music had hookah and music, and it was all just dead silent. It was open, but it was dead silent. And Jake and I sort of looked at each other and we said, something's not right. We got to go. And we kind of hurried back. And it was just dark at that time. And we hurried back toward our hotel. And as we're hurrying back, you see all the motorcycles come in, which was the Taliban. And sort of by the time we got back to the hotel, we went to the roof. It was the tallest building in the city. So you could look down and you saw just a whole bunch of Taliban come in and basically take over the city without firing a single shot, essentially, aside from their celebration shots. There was definitely no fight. And that's what it was. That was the takeover. And again, you're sort of in the middle of this bubble because you're seeing what's happening, but you're also trying to justify that maybe it's not what it looks like. And And then at that point, I think one of my old Afghan fixers who I'd worked with on a previous trip, who was based in London, I was messaging with him, and he was sort of the first one who said to me, yeah, I'm sorry, Mazar's fallen. And that was kind of the confirmation that I didn't want to hear, even though I knew. He was sort of the first one, I guess, from the outside to confirm it. And so that was a Saturday night. So we're watching all this unfold. And then, of course, my phone starts blowing up with people. And
I was one of those people.
Yeah. And I was just trying to I guess, get my head around, what is it that I needed to do next?
Yeah. So August 14th, 2021, I pulled this up in WhatsApp.
Okay.
Hey, Hollie, we're seeing reports that Mazar fell. Is that true? And if so, did you make it out okay? And you responded 2 minutes later. Thank you for the quick response, because I was very worried. Yes, it has. And no, I am under siege. The Taliban is outside, but I don't think that they will enter the hotel. I am trying to get out first daylight. You're sitting in your hotel room. There's Taliban outside. You've been around Taliban before, but now it's different. Now it's clear they're in control now, and it's different. And you've got to be wondering, where do I stand as a woman, as a foreigner, as a journalist?
Yeah.
These are all things that are potentially could make you a target for a hostile takeover by the Taliban. What was your sort of, you're assessing the situation right there. You're staring at these guys right out your window. And it's like, how do you even get up the courage to leave the hotel at that point? Because obviously you eventually did.
Yeah. So there's all these unknowns. And I think that's what made it difficult, because I knew the Taliban wasn't ISIS. If it was ISIS, we're in big trouble. But I knew the Taliban wasn't ISIS. But I also I didn't know what to expect from it. I didn't know what it was going to look like. And again, they just literally, there's hundreds of them. It's an absolute, that you can't just kind of sneak out situation. Mm-hmm. That wasn't going to be the case. And so we thought, well, maybe there's a way to get out, first thing that morning. And I'm in touch with different people, and of course,
probably trying to make a break through the Uzbek border, maybe.
And we're trying to but the Uzbek border was closed, I think, at that point. And, it's funny, again, that night.
Because you weren't the only one with that idea,
sure,
I'm sure.
Yeah. So then that night, we, and you get that notification about your flight being canceled, because our flight out was going to be the Sunday. And so, there's just a whole bunch of unknowns, and a lot of people, telling you different things. And there's, of course, the first, I woke up the next, probably didn't sleep, but maybe for an hour. And you woke up, and it felt like a really different place. You sort of felt like you were plunged back into a medieval time. Just looking out the window, things just looked very different that first morning. And there's still a lot of celebrations. The Taliban sort of celebrated all night, and there was a lot of, their prayers and nasheeds, and so it felt very different. And I'm trying to kind of navigate this. I'm still trying to kind of work a little bit and try to explain what's going on. Mm-hmm. And then, so cut a long story short. So days are going by. Eventually I did get Jake to go out into the market to buy me a burqa, because I thought, well, that's going to be the best way to, figure out, how to at least kind of disguise myself a little bit to get out of here. And I'm in touch with all sorts of different people.
And what's more dangerous at that point, being a man out and about, a Westerner, a male, or being a female? I really don't know. And it almost feels like if I'm in that situation myself, I'd almost feel like, I don't know, I feel like we're both screwed, but for different reasons.
Yeah. Jake got away with it a little bit because he's got a Malaysian background, but they often sort of passed as a Hazara. So, and he had the beard and everything, so he could sort of disguise himself a little bit to get away with it.
I've never met Jake. I've corresponded with him. I've paid his invoices, all these different things.
He's a great human.
I've never met him, but I have a picture in my head of who he is. Malaysian was not in my head.
Very Aussie, but just a wonderful human. So I was really glad that I had him, because so many reporting trips I do, I'm usually by myself. Mm-hmm. Which may well been the case in Afghanistan too, because everyone I had known had left, including the person who'd invited me to be there. So I'm really glad that I had Jake and I sort of, we had, it was a team effort, so to speak. So days are going by, the hotel is sort of running out of food. yeah, again, trying to piece together what's going on, how to get out of here. And eventually, someone sort of said, and eventually I sort of looked at it and I thought, well, the Taliban is having these talks with the United States that have been going in Doha for a long time. They're obviously in touch with them in Kabul, because Kabul fell the next day. That fell on the Sunday. And so with sort of the State Department contact in Kabul that I was messaging with, I said to him, well, I think I could talk to the Taliban. Like, I don't see a way out of this without talking to the Taliban. I mean, I think that is the only way. And to his credit, he didn't kind of balk at it and be like, oh, absolutely not. He was like, well, that could be an option.
Yeah.
Let me think about it, go and talk to someone. And then, so we sort of sat on that. I'm like waiting to hear. And the more that I kind of researched and talked to different Afghans that I knew, and a lot of Afghans in America that had left. And I had one good friend of mine we called Jack. He was from Mazar. So, you know, he had dealt with the Taliban a lot himself. He'd worked as an interpreter for the US. Fortunately, he's passed away now. But he'd worked for the US. He said, look, you know, my uncle was Taliban, you know, like I think, you know, he wasn't maybe as alarmist as so many people were. And he said, I think that's the best way. He was the one that was really encouraging me to talk to the Taliban. And so eventually, it was like, again, trying to figure it out. And then randomly, you know, I got a call, and I don't fully know who orchestrated it. I have some ideas, but I got a call from a young guy who was sort of one of the family. They owned Cam Air, which was one of the Afghan airlines, and who was in contact with the Taliban. And he was kind of facilitator. And he said, look, I think, yeah, you should talk to the Taliban and just kind of get your stuff ready, basically is what he said. Let me figure something out, get your stuff ready. So Jake and I kind of packed up our stuff, really didn't know what was going on. And then we were told to go to the basement of this hotel that we were staying at. And at this point, you know, we knew we had to sort of figure out a way to get out, because the people that were working there, sweet Afghans, you know, they were worried about their families. Again, food was running out. Like, everybody just needed to get home and figure out what this sort of new normal looked like. So we go down to the basement of this hotel, and then I'm told to get in this car. And there was 2 Taliban elders. And so we were in the car with these 2 Taliban elders and driving through Mazar, and they sort of said, welcome. It was, and then, of course, you know, my journalist mode sort of kicks in, and I said, well, can I sort of ask you questions? And so we just started asking them questions. And again, I didn't really know where I was going at this point or what was happening. And so, yeah, so I started asking questions about their beliefs, and you know, they're reciting a lot of very traditional Taliban ideals of, you know, the woman's role, and but yet was so very kind of welcoming of me at the same time, which was sort of strange. And I sort of said that I wanted to sort of, you know, and I wasn't sure what the media landscape was. And they basically said, well, yeah, you can stay. It was not what I was sort of expecting at all. Cut a long story short, they took us to the Uzbekistan embassy there, or consulate. And I think that had been, you know, orchestrated by the American ambassador, who was so wonderful in Uzbekistan. And he had arranged for them to kind of open the border. And then a different Taliban, young sort of bunch of Talibans then escorted us to the border. So then we sort of end up in Uzbekistan, but both Jake and I was sort of like, the story's really not over yet. Like, there was just this sense of unease. Like, I wasn't going to get on a plane and come home, much to the dismay of my family and friends that I, yeah. So again, we then made the decision, well, we're going to go back, because all my stuff, you know, my house, my room, everything was set up in Kabul. So I still had my quote unquote second home there. And so we discussed it sort of for a couple of days and figured out, you know, how we were going to get the money, because obviously the banks and everything had shut down in Afghanistan. So it was a little bit of a blessing, I suppose, to have that opportunity just to kind of figure it out a little bit. And then we went back, and I found a driver again, all these contacts. I ended up calling someone I knew who worked for the Indian government who knew a driver. So it's just the most random sensibilities of people. I was like, well, I need someone to drive me all the way from this border, which is about a 12, 13-hour trip back to Kabul. And, this is just after the takeover, and the US, was on the final stretch there of leaving at that point. And so we made that journey back to Kabul and back to the house that I was staying in. It's suddenly in a very different life and world. And the next day we went to the Ministry of Information and got our permission letters. And I had to randomly find a new fixer on LinkedIn because everybody I knew had left. And that's what began then my next sort of journey of reporting for the next 5 months in Afghanistan.
So you stay there, or you fly out of Kabul and then come back, or?
So no, I stayed there. And so, that was interesting about that time was that, it was sort of the first time, and suddenly you could go to every province. Whereas being in Afghanistan prior to that, you're very limited where you could go because of the level of violence. You could go to Panjshir, maybe you could fly to Kandahar or Herat, but you couldn't move around by car or go to a lot of the places. So really this was like, it felt like suddenly everything had opened up and suddenly we could go everywhere. And in that, I would say, first month, the Taliban were extremely welcoming of people coming in the sense they thought that they could sort of project that they were Taliban 2.0. They were different. They were going to be much more open.
And they didn't want to be seen as the Taliban. They wanted to be seen as the Afghan government, like the Taliban is the government.
Yeah. So, and it just felt like, you could walk onto the MOD and there would be a press conference here, or everything felt very accessible. I remember my fixer that I found, Naweed, who is now an extremely dear friend of mine, he said, oh, well, I've heard about something happening at this kindergarten that was sort of outside Kabul, and let's go check it out. And it was basically a suicide bombing school that we just knocked on the door and said, can we come in? And I went in and, did this sort of whole story and interview with these people training other people to be suicide bombers, and had these huge guns pointed at my head the entire time. But it was just this sort of incredible, I guess, openness.
It's not like that at that time that there was no violence, because there was, if we go back to that point in time, yes, the Taliban took over the country, they took Kabul, but they still were not kosher with ISIS-K, which was still a threat. It was ISIS-K was as much a threat to the U.S. as it was the Taliban.
Yeah. And I interviewed ISIS-K.
Yeah. And those guys, they make the Taliban look pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
And then also you have in some pockets a resistance of former Afghan commandos and stuff that have gone underground, and they want to form a resistance and come back at the Taliban. I'm sure the Taliban was tracking that as well. So everything opened back up and it feels under control, but I feel like there was still like maybe some like things were still maybe boiling beneath the surface a little bit.
Yeah.
But what, that was, you wouldn't have known or maybe necessarily felt that in those immediate few days after that, I'm sure. What did you see and what did you hear about the attack on the Americans at the airport as they were leaving? Was that being talked about?
Right. So I actually went and met with that family several times. I think.
Sorry, which family?
The family that had been bombed.
Okay.
Oh, so this was after the family.
In the retaliation.
Yeah. So in the retaliation. So so at that point, so I was in Mazar when that happened, and I wasn't in Kabul, thank goodness. And I think, I don't know that it was necessarily talked about that much, because I think everyone was just in this desperate situation to get out. I don't think it deterred people from wanting to leave. People were still just trying to find whatever avenue they could up until that last plane left. So everybody was in survival mode. So I don't know that it, and you have to remember, Afghans, this was a horrific bombing, something like 150 Afghans killed. I was going
to say, more Afghans by orders of magnitude died than Americans.
Yeah. And so it wasn't that unusual for them, to be honest, because this is something that they'd lived through for a really long time. And that had become a part of their life, I think. And so there was just so much fear about what was going to happen in having to be stuck or to stay in Afghanistan after that. And so then, of course, then there was the retaliation where the US bombed a family, a car, a Toyota Corolla, believing that it was an ISIS operative. And it turned out that that was not the case, and that a lot of children were killed. And it was just from this one family, and that was just absolutely tragic. So we visited them several times, and that was just heartbreaking because they never received an apology. And I think that there was acknowledgement that that was an error, but and I think the magnitude also of realizing that those sorts of errors, I mean, they happened a lot in Afghanistan, but we don't hear about them because, unlike this particular case, because it happened at a time when all the news was on Afghanistan, it got some attention, but often these things don't, and they're just sort of chalked up to collateral damage.
You know, the news coverage of the whole thing, it was really interesting to watch because you're right. There was, when you say that there was a lack of interest in covering Afghanistan, I mean, that cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
There really was no desire to cover anything Afghanistan, even as the country was starting to fall. It was like editors still believed that this is a non-news story. Americans are sick of reading about Afghanistan and the war there, and this is just another war headline. And they just kept believing that until it got to a point where people really had to be, it was almost like the events that were happening, finally, it was like it grabbed news editors by the shoulders and shook them. Like, no, this is historic and consequential, and you need to pay attention. And then it was like something flipped.
Yeah.
And funny enough, at the same time, that's when the U.S. military started really tamping down on journalist access. And, you know, on HKIA, they were trying to find all the journalists, round them up, put them in a room where they couldn't see and stuff like
and
that.
Send them home, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it got really, really tough. And, you know, our mutual friend, Jericho Denman, who was over there at that time, he was on the base, he got away with continuing to go out there and get footage because people thought that he was like, you know, insert whatever 3-letter agency.
Yeah.
He's a former Army Ranger, so he knew how to walk the walk
Present
and talk
himself,
the talk.
yeah.
But he kind of went incognito as a journalist at that point while everybody else had been rounded up. But it was not a good environment for showing the truth of what was going out. And then even afterwards, there was like this lack of willingness to admit how terribly it had gone. And I don't want to take anything away from the service members that were performing a really miraculous human evacuation in very dire circumstances. There's those Air Force pilots and crew and the people that were on the ground out there trying to genuinely help people.
Yeah.
Like genuinely felt bad for the situation. Young people that hadn't even fought in the height of the war, you know, 19, 20-year-olds who were kids, if not even born when 9/11 happened. And you know, they did all their best, but it was an unmitigated disaster. I mean, when you have video footage of people falling off of airplane wheels because they're so desperate to get out, suicide bombings where, you know, over a dozen Americans and over 150 Afghans are killed, no vetting of who is or isn't going out. I mean, there was a lot of issues with this. So when it comes to bombing a family, it was kind of like, I feel like almost like, oh, just another piece of evidence of how horribly this had been executed. And at that point, I think that the news, I mean, that was covered by American news pretty well, but I feel like it fell flat against the larger story of how disastrous everything was. And to your point, I think almost like, oh, you know, another family that we thought they were bad guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Horrible way to put it, but that is genuinely, I think, a little bit of the attitude.
And also just a reflection of that reflex, I guess, of fearing another bombing like that again and just taking things to the absolute other extreme where the information clearly was not vetted correctly. You know, there's a family that paid a big price for that.
There was that need to show that there was going to be a reaction, a vengeance for what happened at Abbey Gate. Consequences be damned if we get it wrong. I'm sure the people that were involved in that didn't see it that way. I'm sure they would if they were sitting across the table from me right now, I'm sure they would characterize their decision-making process differently. But at the end of the day, the results are the same. There had to have been carelessness because they did get it wrong.
Absolutely. And there's a certain level of, I think, I guess, a lack of responsibility, that there was sort of no acknowledgement. And it was then upsetting to see members of the administration at that time go on to try to tell the American people that they thought that it was a successful evacuation. And I think it doesn't matter your politics at all. You can't look at that and think that that is in any way a sort of a successful way to have done an evacuation.
No, and especially for as long as we'd been in the country, for as much as, and it's easy to sit here and Monday morning quarterback it,
Sure.
but if people recall, this isn't Monday morning quarterbacking, because the things that people have said should have happened are things that people were saying should happen before the evacuation, and they just didn't get listened to.
Yeah.
Things like using Bagram to do the evacuation rather than Kabul, or doing a dual evacuation of Bagram and Kabul, so that not so much pressure. When you made Kabul the entire epicenter of how to get out of Afghanistan, people from all over the country were hopping on the highway, braving Taliban checkpoints, all sorts of different things, trying to hide that they ever worked with Americans. I mean, real distress for any Afghans trying to get out, but also any of the Americans that were like you. For a minute there, you were trying to figure out how to get out of there before you realized, oh, I can hold out here. When it's like everybody has to get to Kabul, you make that the single pressure point.
Yeah.
Like how else is it going to go? And it was like the entire time people tried to, it was like they were trying to hide that we were withdrawing.
Yeah, it was bizarre. And also, like, sort of instead of, taking maybe time with it, or there was this sort of symbolic deadline, I think, of September 11, 20 years.
Yep.
And we were beholden to these. Yeah, that didn't need to be the situation at that time. I mean, even if the Taliban had, already taken over the country, which they already had by the time the Americans had left, I don't think there would have been a huge amount of pushback to, extending that a little bit to make sure the evacuation happened safely. But because we had that self-imposed deadline, I mean, there was no real vetting either of who was coming in. I mean, I know of people that were banned from the US that got to the US, and certainly they weren't service members or people that had, had visas approved, SIV visas. But yet, if you could get in that gate, you could get on a flight.
It was a physical barrier, not an administrative one.
And that's why you also look at so many of those evacuation flights, and they're young men. They're military-age men, because they're the ones with the strength to muscle through that crowd, whereas the wives and the sisters and the daughters and the mothers, they don't, and they're the ones that are left behind.
Trying to throw their babies up over the barbed wire.
And so, that to me also spoke volumes, because we didn't know who was getting out, but part of me felt really sad about the fact that, I think about it a little differently, I think, to a lot of my friends, in that nobody can do your fighting for you. The Americans can't win Afghanistan for you. And that was the saddest part, is seeing all these young, able-bodied Afghans leave, because if you aren't going to be the ones fighting for your country, then who is? And so then it was very apparent to me that that it was a lost cause, because the Afghans were all leaving. The Afghan men that they weren't
president
stayed.
Went into hiding.
The president left. All these warlords, the Dostums, and they all left. And even when I sort of went back to Panjshir, and there was still this narrative going on about how Panjshir, which had been the bastion of resistance in the last Taliban rule of the country, where it was the only province that wasn't taken over. But when I went, there was very clear that it was in Taliban control. And I got this huge amount of hate for reporting that. I went to all through, and there was no fighting. It was very clear to me that the Taliban was in control, and that a lot of the stories the media was reporting were basically being told by these Panjshiris who weren't even there anymore. And there's still a lot of lies coming from, Panjshiri leaders, without naming names, who pretend that they're still there, that they're not. And that was being completely misconstrued. And so in reporting the fact, like, here's what I'm seeing. This is what I'm, I think in the time that I spent there, maybe I heard like 2 outgoing rockets or something. There was certainly no firefight. It was very clear the Taliban had control. The amount of hate I received from people who just refused to accept that. I just remember, sitting on my steps and in Kabul and being just bawling my eyes out, thinking, oh my gosh, like, all these people hating me, and I'm trying to report the truth. What am I doing? And feeling like I can't weather this. Like, this is like This is so much. And then, really having to pull myself together and be like, look, I'm the one that's here. These people aren't. They can attack me all they like, but here's the situation. Mm-hmm. So I felt very vindicated. It was a couple of weeks later, and I think a reporter for New York Times or Wall Street Journal, can't remember which, but several weeks after my report came out and basically said the same thing. So in some ways, I'm like, okay, I'm not the only one who's like saw what I saw. And so that's always the hard part, especially with social media now. You can be on the ground. We talk about fake news, but even you can be on the ground reporting exactly what you see. And I wasn't trying to sum up any great analogy beyond what I saw, and you can still be accused of being fake news.
Yeah. I went through a similar thing. The stakes weren't quite as high, but when I covered the Standing Rock oil pipeline protest, that was a highly political, highly covered thing. And I went up there, was on the ground, and was kind of coming to some conclusions that didn't fit neatly into some of the narratives that were being spun about it. And, you sit there and get questioned by people who aren't there. And I'm like, I'm literally just telling you what I'm seeing here. I'm standing right here, talking to these people, watching with my own two eyes. Like, I'm right here. Like, I don't have a narrative, anything like that. I'm telling you what I see. If you don't believe me, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, and by the way, here's pictures and video on top of it. It is crazy when some people get tied to their, like, especially if it's like a party line sort of thing.
Yeah.
People don't want to break from that. And so if you report something that goes against that narrative, then it gets really difficult sometimes. And you have to question. It's like you get really rigorous about your own reporting because you're like, God, I can't get this wrong. I'm going to be skewered if I get this wrong, because that the pressure is out there.
Yeah. And it's just, frustrating because people wanted this great resistance story that didn't exist.
I did. It's a very romantic idea.
Yes.
I loved the idea of this resistance that was going to stay behind and
I still hear stories about it. That's just, I'm like, it's just not true. It's not true.
Yeah. I wanted to believe it because part of you, I think, wants to believe that it wasn't all for naught, that that all the military age males didn't leave, that there's some staying behind and they're going to fight for their country and against all the odds. And it's a very Hollywood sort of narrative that you can concoct in your head if you let your imagination go with it, especially with you, like you said, some of the sort of selective images that were released, and there was a little bit of a campaign there. And it just, like you said, it's just, that wasn't reality. And as much as you wanted it to be, not much has changed in Afghanistan for the better in the past 4 years, as far as from a American point of view.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of Afghans that would argue like, hey, we don't mind the Taliban because we aren't dealing with a foreign military, every single day anymore. I'm sure some people would say that. I think a lot of women in Afghanistan who knew what life was like there before that could go to school and do a bunch of different things. They probably feel a lot different. And I know some of your reporting has covered that. How is life for women in Afghanistan post U.S. withdrawal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a pretty rapid decline. It's again, it just slowly chipping away. It wasn't sort of all at once. It was a slow chipping away of the rights that women had. And I think it's also important to remember that there's sort of two types of Afghan women, so to speak. You've got the ones that were in the cities, like in Kabul, in Herat, where they were exposed to schooling and jobs and, all these things. And then that was stripped away. But there was also Afghan women who lived in villages, and that was never their reality, and that their lives improved when the Taliban came because the fighting essentially diminished. So they felt like they could walk out of their home and go to a market now, that they couldn't do that safely before. And things like jobs and education, and that was sort of never part of their lives anyway. So I think it's always important to remember that we tend to look at Afghan women through the lens of these urban centers, but that's only a portion of the picture in Afghanistan.
A majority of the women in Afghanistan are in cities, though.
Yeah.
Kabul was the fastest growing city in the world for a couple of years there. I think the majority of the Afghanistan's population is in Kabul, but that certainly doesn't mean that women don't exist outside of the population centers. And
it's been painful to sort of see what that's been like in terms of them losing their schooling, and losing education, ability to work, ability just to kind of be more than, buried in the basement essentially. And so that's been a really steady decline over the last 4 years to watch. And it wasn't quite like that in the beginning, but you would sort of see it steadily erode. And then I went back for some time 3 years ago now. So that was, October of 22. And even at that point, it's had been such a sharp decline from a year earlier. And then what we're seeing now, obviously, is just really unbelievably heartbreaking. And the sad thing is that the international community is certainly powerless to do anything about it. And I think, too, there's a lot of Taliban that I'd met with that also didn't agree with the sort of the ruler of the supreme leader, who is basically setting the tone for
the Taliban is not a monolith.
Yeah. And we don't even know. We've never seen the supreme leader in real life. He's never released an audio message, and I don't know if he exists or if he is.
Do we have a Wizard of the Oz sort of situation
so that's the thing,
here?
Like, okay, well, we're told it's, this one supreme leader, but who is it? Could it be the ISI? Could it be a group of, we just don't know but yet whoever that figure is
if
the
you
one.
Figure out that the Iranians were behind it the entire time.
We don't know. So, but that figure or figurehead is the one setting all the rules, and there is it's an absolute rule. So there's no ability to kind of argue with that. But, but yeah, the Taliban, they're certainly members of the Taliban that don't agree with that either necessarily, but they don't have a choice but to go with it. And, it's shocking and hard to believe. And it stems from that sort of Pashtun culture and this belief of women needing to be sort of hidden and buried. And the way that Taliban will describe that to you is they see that as protecting women, as being kind to women, as women shouldn't having to be. Why should women be working? They should be, and to them, when they describe it, it's not a derogatory thing the way that we think of it is. To them, this is how you protect women, like the same way as they won't necessarily look at me when I'm talking to them. They see that as protecting me. They see that as a sign of respect.
You could make an argument for that, but where you obviously it loses most of us is when you remove the choice.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to say, oh, it's respectful to not look at women or whatever. Like, okay, I could wrap my head around that. But when you say they can't go to school or they can't, well, that's out of respect. Well, if they don't have a choice in the matter, then it's not really respect. It's just power.
You're putting them in a box of how you believe. But it's a totally patriarchal society. And and what's been frustrating is that it seems to me that the international community just doesn't have any leverage at all to change that.
Or desire. I think there's certainly people that care or can recognize that it's a really bad situation, but they've got their own bad situations they're dealing with. And there's other crises happening around the world where, women are being subjected to horrible things. And, I empathize with somebody that might say like, yeah, what's happening to women in Afghanistan is terrible. Also, what's happening in Ukraine is terrible. Also, what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa is terrible. Also, what's happening in Western China is terrible. Like the list goes on. There's some bad shit happening in a lot of different places. But, with Afghanistan though, we're so invested there because we were for 20 years in both lives and resources, money, all those things. Like, a lot of Americans spent some of their best years in that country. I'm rambling at this point because it's I have a lot of feelings about that place.
I think anyone who has been in Afghanistan has very strong feelings. It's a hard place to. I mean, this is not politically correct, but this is what Jake used to say, is that Afghanistan was sort of like the abusive husband, is that you wanted to leave, but you could never leave. Like you just kept going back. And I think that's certainly, as journalists, how we felt about Afghanistan was that it beat us around so many times where we just said, we had enough. This is too frustrating. We don't want to work here, but yet we'd find ourselves back there and back there and back there and totally consuming your life.
Genuinely beautiful place. Some of the most beautiful sights and sunrises, sunsets that I've ever seen have been in the Afghan mountains and the Spingar Mountains. Some of the best people I've ever met, some of the worst people on planet Earth. I mean, it's a complex place that you can't paint with a single brush. How do you feel about I'm sure you've seen it on like Instagram or TikTok, these younger influencers that are going over to Afghanistan now and kind of clearly in sort of collaboration with the Taliban tourism arm, trying to make it seem like a place to go on vacation to. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't think that's particularly wise. Again, you know, I admire the adventurous spirit. It certainly takes a lot of guts to decide that you're going to get up and go to Afghanistan. But I do think that we also need to remember that, and it's not war anymore, but, you know, I'll use the frame war tourism, I guess post-war tourism. You know, that comes with responsibility, I think, when you're in a place of, you know, privilege, as I'm sure a lot of these people are. And I think unless you're going there to be serious about you're informing people of what's happening, you know, but if you're going there to kind of do a promo for the Taliban, then that's kind of gross. Yeah. I mean, you know, you might not be breaking any laws, but it's ethically, you know, I'd question a lot about you doing that, especially, you know, given what has transpired there and what Afghan women are going through. And, you know, it's certainly not a place I would be recommending, you know, for your next vacation.
There's other places to go experience Middle Eastern or Southwest Asian
and it's a shame
culture.
because I would love everybody to be able to say, you know, Afghanistan is amazing. It certainly is, but I don't think in this particular climate that it's, you know, to kind of go over there and do a promo, you know, in sort of support of the Taliban is, you know, an especially bright thing to do.
Yeah, I follow all these different travel pages and things like that. You know, I love traveling, whether it's for work or personal. I love traveling. I was telling you, I want to go to 100 countries at some point. I'm not even halfway there yet. But, you know, I follow these places. And when those started, you know, these guys that like, you know, you're swiping through and then it pops up, you'll never guess where I'm at. And it's, you know, they've got you know, some traditional dress on and some things like that. And then it zooms out and you're in a truck filled with a bunch of Taliban and they're all like broing out. And you're just like, this is not yes, what you're filming is real there, but it's constructed. Yeah. They know who you are. You're over there because you have influence. They are trying to influence how them and their country, like you said, Taliban 2.0, some of that sort of stuff, but you're obviously not showing a lot of what the reality is when you're doing something like that. And I guess that's the same about anybody that goes anywhere and does travel material. It's like, oh yeah, people, you know, guess what? Being on a resort on the Dominican Republic is not reality in the Dominican Republic. Like that's a constructed vacation land, you know? So it's not like it only happens in Afghanistan. It just seems particularly reprehensible to me.
Yeah, it's very egregious.
Yeah. But, you know, when this happened, when you were over there reporting in Afghanistan, this was, like I said, not your first time in a war zone. You were actually a very experienced journalist at this point. When I look back on your career, you kind of, you know, you're an Australian that comes over to the US and you kind of immediately get into the media world, it seems like. But your initial work at like Fox News and some of these other places, it was kind of like this like celebrity coverage, like pop, like not TMZ, but you know, you would almost put it in that category. Like, how do you, I mean, that was your foot in the door, I'm sure.
Sure,
you do what you got to do when you're starting off.
I wasn't even 20.
But how do you, it's like you go from that to immediately like the next year you're in war zones.
Yeah.
There wasn't this gradual transition where you like go to like serious news report, you know, serious news journalism. And then you go reporting. It was like this very much I'm covering what's going on with J-Lo one day. And then I'm over in life and death situations.
Yeah. So actually, there's a little bit more behind the scenes, but yeah. So technically, I was
probably watering it down.
Yes. So I was based in Los Angeles, so just sort of doing lots of different stories. But by, I guess, virtue of being in LA, we did there was a lot of entertainment, which definitely was great training ground because I was, again, very young, 20 years old, and had this great opportunity to work for this network that was sponsoring me. But it was a great training ground in the sense that you learn to cut through the bullshit very quickly. And so, you know, you're sort of surrounded by these kind of A-list people. And I guess I look back at it now and you're invited to like all these very cool places. And I look back at many different situations I've been in, from Diddy parties to, being on a private jet with, Demi Moore and Paris Hilton to, I don't know, just all these things which I just didn't give a shit about, I guess. And you also learn to cut through the bullshit. So when, there's often layers of people and I think I was pretty brash at the time because I didn't care. And, you really just had to cut to the chase to get the story. But having said all of that, I was also sort of thrown into the deep end of a lot of these investigative stories at the time. I think because I was young and Australian and just very unassuming, I could extract a lot of information from people that were very oblivious to, and I was good at that, I guess. So that really showed my bosses that I was very versatile. So I think that they put a lot of trust in me because of that. They, realized that there was a lot more that I wanted out of my career, and that I could, certainly do other things. And then I'd traveled a lot on my own, just as a young woman. And so I sort of was writing pieces from, different places that I was traveling to. And then, I guess that's sort of just how I kind of got started. And I was able to prove myself, I think, very quickly, and ended up, I guess, on front lines very early in my career, not by necessarily planning it, but, by just having contacts, and that's how things worked out. So it was very much a baptism by fire, I think, in the beginning of my career, being in Syria, being in Iraq. And that it just kind of, once I started doing that work, that it felt so important to me, that was all that I wanted to do. And again, thankfully, I had bosses, one boss in particular who's still a good friend of mine. He's retired now, but who just believed in me. And that's what it really takes, I think, is that one person to believe in you when everybody else will just look at you and think, well, she's the young entertainment girl. What does she know about, a conflict? But I think I remember just treating it like that it was totally my lifestyle. And I remember just reading everything that I possibly could, reading every possible book of history and every sort of foreign policy trade magazine, and just immersing myself 24/7 in trying to really understand these places that I was going to and visiting and covering. And it was, you have to throw yourself totally in the deep end, and recognize that it's a total lifestyle job. It's not a 9 to 5. It's not something you can just do a little bit, then check out. And that, especially in the beginning when you're trying to get your foot established, that it takes everything. And that's, I think I was at a place in my life. I was young. I had the time and ability to be able to do that. And really, you have to prove yourself in that way. And that's what I did. What
was your first conflict reporting trip? Like, what was your first day in a war zone?
Like? So I covered some Syria. That was kind of my first. I guess covered's not the right word, because that was more working on my own things that I was doing just to learn. But my first kind of work with Fox was Iraq. So that was like 2013, and then ISIS happened, and so that I was sort of in the very beginning, and really kind of stayed there for the next sort of 5 years, going in and out. And that was really my focus in that part of the world. And then Afghanistan came into it, and then Yemen, and then just kind of really broadening from there. But sort of Syria, Iraq was my early,
So what were some of your early stories that, trying to establish yourself on the ground? This is your first time in a war zone.
A lot of the work that, I was doing. I remember in the beginning, I guess right after that ISIS takeover, being, on a front line with a bunch of Kurds that was not far from Mosul Dam. And so that was sort of that was the beginning of a lot of conflict, I guess, so to speak. So that was very much... in the line of fire, I guess, and interviewing ISIS prisoners. And I think I was really one of the first Western journalists to have that kind of access to do that. Mind you, they were prisoners. They weren't, in the wild. I did interview ISIS a little bit later in the wild, but so that was very much when we were trying to figure out what this group was and what it represented. And so that to me kind of felt like I started to figure out what I was doing a little bit. And so that really became, I think, something I felt very focused on and wanting to understand. And there were just so many different layers to it, I think, at the time. And when I was first there, the US had already, years ago, end of 2011, had withdrawn from Iraq. So the US presence wasn't there in the beginning. And then slowly over time, you started to see the US kind of coming back and supporting the Iraqi military. And then you're sort of trying to understand there's so many different dynamics of like Hashd-Shabi, which was sort of the Iranian-backed militias, their role in this, the role of the Kurds, the role of the Iraqi army, the role of the Americans and the rest of the coalition. And then also trying to, again, understand the ISIS point of view. And I would go on to interview as many different, fighters as they could and their families and just cover it, I think, from as many angles as I could. And that's where I really felt like the US was lacking in media coverage, was that we're really only seeing it from one particular lens, or we're seeing things, or we're trying to frame things in very black and white terms. And it's so much more nuanced than that. And so that's really what I was trying to understand. And I just felt like if I didn't understand a lot of this stuff, then certainly, the American readership wasn't going to understand a lot. So it's sort of in some ways, you're a translator, trying to translate sometimes a very difficult situation in a way that people can understand, but they can also grasp that it isn't as simple as we would like it to be. And so I felt that trying to sort of cover those angles was really important.
Did you ever see that? I forget, maybe it was in Time. I forget exactly which publication put it out, but it was this diagram that showed all the different power players in the Syria, Iraq. And so all the different tribes, all the, from the PKK to the, SDF and all the different Iraq factions, tribal leaders, Russians, Americans, Chinese, all the, it was this massive web of people that all had a interest in what was going on there. And to the average person that looks at that, you're like, how does anything get done over there? Like, holy cow, it is not this like bad guy versus good guy, black versus white sort of thing. It's a very complicated thing. Even at its simplest points in Iraq, it was very complicated because you're dealing with tribal dynamics and, Shia versus Sunni versus, it is just all these different things that you're dealing with that are very foreign to, I would say, most of the world, at least most of the Western world, that don't think in those terms. We think in terms of political parties or states or maybe even class, but thinking in terms of tribalism and some of these things that have maybe gone out of vogue in human society.
Yeah, very different culture and very different motivations. And, one thing I remember trying to kind of explain to I was at a dinner when I came back from one trip, and I was trying to explain to a couple of these FBI agents that were there that focused on terrorism, just how the motivations for joining a group like ISIS were often so different to when you're actually there. The motivations are very different to, say, someone who goes and commits an attack on US soil in the name of ISIS. And what I found to be, when those things happen on US soil, they're typically very religiously motivated. They've been radicalized, and we look at what happened in San Bernardino, if we remember that terrorist attack, and there was Orlando, the nightclub in Orlando. So often those are very religiously motivated attacks, but that isn't always the case for people joining these groups when they're actually in Iraq or Syria. It's a factor, but it's not the factor. Oftentimes it's sort of necessity. ISIS comes and they take over your village. I mean, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? You still have to work. You still have to. So, you might be working at a bakery, and previously, your boss was one person. Now your boss is someone different because you don't have the money or the luxury to just kind of get up and leave. Sometimes it's not safe to do so. And so just say you have different levels of kind of motivation that I think came into it is what I found a lot. Yeah.
A lot of these people that did get up and leave, they ended up in these IDP or internally displaced person
which is really
camps.
A horrible way to live.
Yeah. I mean, I went to a refugee camp for Syrian Kurds right outside. It was like halfway between Erbil and Mosul. Mosul, and you go there and you talk to some of these people. Of course, all the adults, they remember life before ISIS and everything. But then you meet these kids that are going to school inside these camps. They were born in the camp. They don't know of any other life besides life in this refugee camp. That sucks.
Yeah,
that's a really tough way to grow up, and you feel bad for those kids, and they were the ones that were fortunate enough to get out of life under ISIS. That's tough, for the people that weren't able to, like you said, that's a fortunate position to be in, to be able to escape that. Many didn't. Many just had to endure and endure some pretty terrible things.
And I remember going back, and each time I go back, going to these same camps and seeing these same kids, sort of over time, and how much of the life was just stripped away with them. So like in the beginning, they're still playing, they're still kind of happy. It's still kind of like being at summer camp or something.
Yeah.
And then you go back and over time, there's less resources. Funding dries up, schooling dries up. There are other crises in the world that suddenly start to get attention because people get bored of, one thing.
NGOs shift.
Yes. And you just see the life kind of sucked out of them. So these children that, were once happy, kind of go lucky, you just see these sort of deadpan, terribly sad. And I think about those kids a lot and think, they would be, well into their teen years now. A lot of them that were just little when I first encountered them, and just, wondering, what happened to them, what happened to their lives and who they are. And just so painful all the way around. And there's a lot of those camps that, still there. They still have people because there's nowhere for a lot of people to go back to.
For all intents and purposes, they're basically towns, new settlements at this point, because they'll never be able to go back to where they came from. There's no other place for them to go. So they just basically have to stay where they're at.
And there's so much fear associated with going back to, their hometowns.
There's so many different sides to a war than just the shooting, and that's something that you've covered really well throughout the years. What are the things, not the shooting, not the attacks, not the combat, right? What are the things that stand out most to you when you look back at the different places you've been around the world covering war and conflict?
Things that stand out. I think that, I mean, it's always, I think the simplicity of being with families, but I think what always stands out to me is how in so many of these places, just how giving people are, when they don't have anything, but they'll give you whatever they can. And they're just so grateful that, a foreign journalist has come to kind of tell their story and has given up their comfortable life to, live a much more uncomfortable life for a brief period of time. And so I think there's just, this sort of sense of overwhelming gratitude from people that I guess remind you of the good in people. And that's something I take away a lot, was just really how a human's ability to pick themselves up, time and time again. And a lot of the times, especially in somewhere like Iraq that has been, or Afghanistan that has had so many conflicts back to back, just people's ability to just, I guess, keep going. And your house might get bombed and it might get bombed again. But you just somehow you keep going. And that to me has always just been fascinating, I guess, is the ability just to do that and to detach yourself from, I guess, ownership of things and just focus on that one ability to survive.
It is life-changing to see people in the most extreme circumstances that a human can find themselves in. I'm certain of that. You can't look at anything else the same anymore. Both good and bad. Yeah. Right? It just, you get exposed to different things and nothing ever looks or feels the same. And it's, certainly it's, and people like you, like me, and other people that go over, we're guests and observers. That's not our reality that we have to live in for the rest of our lives. They do. Yeah. That's something. You go from, covering wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are the wars that most of the world is very familiar with, right? It's been on their nightly news. It's been on all over YouTube and all these other places. You've covered lesser known wars. Can you take us over to Africa and Sudan, and
Yeah. So
what was that
yeah,
like?
I did a trip there. That was last year, end of last year. I mean, that was just, that the focus of that was Darfur. And yeah, it's hard to describe. Absolutely heartbreaking of what these people, I guess the inhumanity of it all, the sort of, I think just the worst things of what humans can do to each other. That's what's happening, just, yeah, the dehumanization of somebody else because of their skin color, their tribe. And what you are seeing in Darfur, really in blunt terms, it's a racial war. You've got Arabs versus sort of the Black African tribes. And I don't see it framed enough that way as what it should be, because that is the reality of what is happening there. There's a lot of outside interests, as well. These weapons aren't just kind of flying their way into the country and into the hands of, the RSF. But yeah, if you could degrade, it blows my mind that humans have the ability to degrade another human to that extent. The
To the point where they don't see them as humans.
Absolutely, yeah.
They are problems that are to be mitigated,
the level
not
of
humans.
Sexual violence, the level of torture, the level of absolute, just sort of annihilation.
Darfur, it rises to the level of genocide, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw that, in the early 2000s. And essentially, yes, that's what we are seeing again. We are seeing it again, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. It doesn't make the headline news the way that other conflicts like in the Middle East do. And I think the easiest explanation for that is because the US doesn't have the same commitment or level of interest.
There's no US troops necessarily.
There's no US troops. I guess US interests aren't hugely affected by, what happens in that region.
There's no mineral rights at play.
Right. So we don't see it as much. And, that is, I do see that from both sides. I see on one hand, there are so many hotspots and hardships in the world. The US can't possibly.
And I don't want to make that sound like I'm saying we should have boots on the ground in Darfur. We certainly don't need another.
So I see it certainly from the sort of the pragmatic side of being like, well, the US it can't be everywhere. It can't focus. I get that, but at the same time, it's really hard to kind of sit by and see this happening and watch this happening and know that while we are the most powerful country on the planet, that we're not really doing a lot. And sometimes you don't have to do a lot to be able to make a difference. But in speaking out, that's usually a big first step in and in these countries that are supplying weapons, to the RSF, are allies to the United States. So we do have leverage, but
we have leverage everywhere in the world that we choose to have it.
Just not the political will. And so that is really, that's really painful to kind of sit and watch and feel just, very incredibly helpless.
I'm very ignorant of the situation there. I've never covered Africa professionally. I have traveled very little there. And so I know the broad strokes about some of the things that are happening with Al-Shabaab and some different terrorist organizations. I've looked into a little bit about the 127E programs that the U.S. military runs in different countries around Africa. But I say that to say largely, I know the wave tops and that's it, particularly in Sudan and Darfur. Is it good guys versus bad guys, or people in power versus people not in power? Or is it truly, when you say it's, Muslim Arabs versus tribal Africans?
Yeah.
Is one of them good and one of them bad? Or is it kind of just humans fighting each other?
I would say, in the mix of it all, certainly, RSF is what they used to call the Janjaweed in the Darfurian conflict in the early 2000s. And that is, I guess, they're backed by a lot of wealthy Arab countries. This is very oil-rich land. This is particularly...
So there is mineral rights.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is gold, gold in particular. But this is why a lot of the Arabs are kind of trying to take over the land where the Darfurian tribes are, because it's very valuable land. So there is that part of it that's been long simmering conflict. And the tribes in this, in this rendition of it, back in the, again, early 2000s, it was, Omar Bashir was the dictator who was kind of I guess, backing the Janjaweed against the people. This case, he's obviously gone. So the government troops, I guess, are the ones that are fighting the RSF. And certainly within those government troops, there are atrocities that committed. There are bad apples. But, if I have to look at it, it's sort of you can't morally equate each side. And I think really for a long time, that's what used to frustrate me about Darfur, was that we'd see, at the time, Anthony Blinken, he would often come out with these statements, or the State Department would come out with sort of the statements that were basically like both sides need to stop, both sides need to, and I get that, but there is clearly one side that's doing things that are a lot more atrocious than the other side, which is the RSF.
Curious
yes,
about.
So the RSF being, those militias, and they're backed by, Libya, they're backed by UAE, they're backed by all these other foreign interests. And not to say that, that the army is not getting support from foreign interests too, because it also is, gets support from Iran and other places. But at the end of the day, it's again, you're trying to morally equate two different sides.
Is this like the definition of a proxy war?
In some ways it is, yes. Because there are a lot of outside interests. I mean, obviously, things are happening on the ground between, groups that live there, but there's certainly, I would certainly say there's a lot of elements of a proxy war.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's hard to look at any war now and not totally see proxy elements.
And this is the way wars have gone since for millennia.
Yeah.
There's always outside foreign interests. The American Revolution, there was outside interests. We had the French involved. We had the French, I think, who were very much at odds with the UK back then. You're like, that was very convenient that those rascally Americans were given the British fits. It's like that with any war, that you're going to have somebody where one side is going to, one nation or group of people will benefit by one side winning versus another. And whether that's mineral rights, whether that's influence in a certain region, whatever it is, a place to put a base because it's strategically, convenient to reaching a place like China or Russia. Like, these are things that you have to think about in all of these. But for me, I'm always very interested in the morality of war at this point. And I think it's always I always have such a tough time forming an opinion on these things when there's not a clear good guy or bad guy.
Yeah.
And some of these things in Africa, you look at them and you're like, gosh, one side is like clearly oppressing the other, but then that other side was like doing really shitty things before. And I don't know how I feel about this. And I'm kind of glad America's not involved, but it's certainly terrible. And then you think about the kids who they don't choose. They just drew the shittiest, shortest straw of the life lottery of where they were born. And it's hard. I don't know how to feel about it necessarily.
It is. And it is hard, I think. And I think about this a lot too, in the sense that, I think having spent so much time in war, being very anti-war, but also in the sense that I don't see anything good come out of conflicts, wars. You end up with, who makes money out of them? The weapons makers, they're the ones that come away the
defense
best.
Contractors, politicians.
Everybody else, I don't see in any benefit.
The only silver lining I've ever been able to come to about what good does war serve any part of humanity? You typically will see giant leaps forward in technology, especially around medicine, that come out of wars. That will definitely ends up benefiting humanity. Man, there's got to be a better way to come to those conclusions.
Sure, and I also,
that can't be the only good thing that
comes out of it. But then at the same time, I really hate bullies, and these wars are often started by bullies and perpetuated by bullies, and so there's a part of me that really wants to rally against that too. And I don't have the perfect answer for what the response is all the time, but I don't think the response is to look away, but it's very hard. And I think the US is always in a tough position of you sort of go in and stay for a long time like you do in Afghanistan and you're doomed. You sort of go in and out like you did in Libya and you're doomed, or you don't go in at all and like say in Syria and you're doomed.
Yep.
So there really isn't a right way. And that's the shitty part about it, is and so that brings me back to what needs to be done to prevent these wars from the first place. Is there enough being done to stop these wars happening before they happen, and that's where you see the real kind of failures, I guess, at the United Nations and other places that just, these bodies were set up for that purpose, and we're not seeing that happen.
It has, prevented another world war. We haven't seen a truly world war since World War II. That's a good thing.
Yep.
And I think that the UN and NATO and some of those bigger organizations deserve some credit there. But what it has not helped with is basically these small regional wars from happening perpetually everywhere all the time. There's always a war going on somewhere. And you just would think that at this point that if countries, and sometimes it's perpetuated by the same countries that say that they want peace. Like the US has very often been the ones stoking the flames of war because they wanted to remove one person that was not friendly towards our wishes and replace it with another. I mean, how many Middle Eastern leaders that became very inconvenient toward us later on were people that we put in place.
Yeah. And we're seeing like that shift now with Venezuela. I think that's really, keep your eye on that, because that's what the rhetoric, from what I'm hearing, that's a big focus right now.
Venezuela's been in a tough spot for 6, 7, 8 years at this point, ever since there was a coup. So, Maduro is just an illegitimate leader, full stop. Yeah. I think after Chavez died, he kind of came to power and has never followed an election to let other winners, like what we saw in the most recent election. He's not willing to give up power. And that is a tough spot to be in, because Venezuelans have demonstrated overwhelmingly they don't want him. They're voted against him, but he's a dictator who will not leave. And so that's a challenging position to be in. But it is, Latin America is close to the US, and we have oil interests in Venezuela. And so, that's why the US isn't sort of sitting idly by, and it'll be framed, as being part of the sort of the anti-drug war. But, it's more than just that. Yeah, the drug war is a real thing, but it's not everything that meets the eye. There's always more interest than just stopping the fentanyl flow.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. Yeah. I do think that there needs to be things to stop that stuff from coming into the country. We need to disincentivize that coming in. I had Ian Frisch on recently, a couple episodes back, and he just wrote a book with the only FBI agent to ever go undercover in the cartel, and amazing memoir, and really interesting. It's called Inside the Cartel.
Okay.
He's the only one to ever do it, and he did it for years and years and years. Really fascinating stuff, like how the whole black market peso exchange works and how they wash money and how these things all really work. And one thing that becomes clear when you look into this stuff is these are not just simple problems to solve, and they largely cannot be solved just purely by military action alone. Yeah. The cartels are very powerful. They would, the major cartels would be Fortune 500, if not Fortune 50 businesses if they were legitimate. That's how much money they are moving. They have connections at the very highest levels of government, not just in the US, but in a lot of other places. This isn't just as simple as we're going to drop a couple of missiles on drug runner boats and go there. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Frankly, I think guys that are involved in the cartel, I do think it's appropriate to label them as terrorist organizations. I think that's appropriate.
I think it's appropriate to be very clear who we're bombing, and that's not apparent right now.
Yeah, like it has to be. We have to know, again, we can't have these situations like we just talked about in Afghanistan where a family gets bombed. This can't be a family out boating.
Yeah, or a fisherman or whatever.
I'd like to think that they're good, but we do need more information at this point. And this is another one of those things where I'm all about putting pressure on cartels. I hate what they do and they don't do any good on behalf of the world. I hate that. But what we're doing right now feels like we're creeping in on another undeclared war.
Yeah.
And that's where I get a little bit worried about, like, hey, what exactly are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
What are the stakes? And what are the goals, and how are we defining victory here? Yeah. Because this like perpetual, that's what the drug war has been since the Reagan years, right? It's this perpetual kind of the drug war, and you just kind of get this carte blanche check to go do things for the drug war. And but what does victory look like? Is it zero drugs being imported into the U.S.? Is it the like, I don't know what it is. And do I believe what the stated goals are to begin with? And this is immaterial to any administration, because every administration for the past 40 years in the United States has participated in the drug war in one way or another. So it's like, what are the goals? And then do I believe the goals that you're telling me? Because to your point, I don't necessarily believe it's just about drugs. Venezuela has too much oil for me to not consider that as part of the equation. And also the Panama Canal is a major
hub.
Like there's too many other things at play here for it to be just about drugs.
Yes. Yeah. There is, the US is just, it's not that altruistic, you know. There's more to it than that.
There always is.
But earlier this year, I was doing some work in Mexico for a book project I've been working on, where I was interviewing a lot of moms whose children were disappeared by the cartels. And we're talking about a crisis of sort of
Hollie, you do some tough, holy cow.
Yeah, so 150,000 to 200,000 people that are disappeared, that are just missing. Primarily, you know, from these organized crime groups. And
I have to assume that, sorry to interrupt, not just dead. I assume that this is a major feeder of international sex trafficking.
Yes, all sorts of
tell me what you
trafficking.
learned.
Yeah, so, you know, and each case obviously is unique. And a lot of these parents, you know, some of them, their kids have been missing 15 years or so. To, you know, give you a couple of examples, you know, one being one woman I met with whose daughter went missing, and it was during the pandemic. And so she sort of didn't have a lot of direct contact with her at the time because of all the different rules around sort of socializing. And her daughter had just started dating somebody new, I think, who she believes was part of a sex trafficking ring. And she was kind of lured in by his friend and another woman. And then she just, I guess, never heard from her again until she got a message on Facebook one day that was said, but, you know, your daughter is married. You'll find your daughter kind of in this mountainous area where they sort of call it, it's just outside of Mexico City. And it's a big area where they're often finding, you know, bones and other remains. But what was so sad to me, and this was years on, and then eventually, you know, her mom, so each weekend they call them collectives, and because they're really not getting support from the Mexican government. I mean, because the scale is so big, nobody bats an eye if they say, you know, so-and-so's daughter is disappeared. That's normal. In you know, and sadly that's normal. And it becomes the parents' responsibility to look for their child. So they join these collectives, I guess. And so they'll help each other out if they can. They'll go searching, you know, these expanses of land on weekends. And a lot of the time, you know, what's even more is that these women often get laid off their jobs if their boss finds out that they have a missing child, because the boss figures that you're going to be too focused on looking for your child. You're not going to do a good job. So you need to go and focus on your child. And so they'll lose their jobs on top of everything else.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a horrible crisis. And so, yeah, but in this particular case, Jacqueline, her name was, she found some remains. She's found lots of remains over the years, but it did, you know, turn out to be that some remains that she'd found in November of last year were her daughter. But, you know, she's still very driven because she feels like she hasn't found all of them. So she's still very driven to trying to find out. But, you know, she believes in, again, they do all the investigative work themselves. And it's so sad because these parents will come, and when I go to meet with them, they've just got these files of things that they've put together that they bring, of photos, of newspaper clippings, of just everything that they could possibly find, that they do themselves to try to piece together what happened. I mean, in her case, she believes that, you know, her daughter was taken in a sex trafficking ring and you know, threatened and basically, you know, not doing as she was told, and was killed as a result of that. In some ways, Jacqueline is sort of one of the lucky ones because she has some sense of closure, although it doesn't quite feel like closure to her. But there's so many parents also that I met with whose children have, you know, were in another case. You know, one was an engineer, and he'd moved to a different town to to work and believes that the company, which is a major company still today in Mexico, does a lot of infrastructure work that has big contracts, was involved in corruption with the Zeta cartels, and which again,
You
that
can't really
happens
be
in
a big
Mexico,
company
yes,
in
without
Mexico.
having corruption. And so she believes, her son was, privy to some of this, and so he was kind of disappeared as a result of that. And that was a long time ago. Another one was trying to drive to Texas to see a friend who just had a baby. She kind of got contact from him at one particular checkpoint, and then he disappeared not shortly after that. And she thinks that cartels will kind of will go to people and figure out what they do for a living, and if maybe they're useful, they'll kidnap them. In his case, he was a sort of a telecom engineer, and she said not long after that, these cell phone towers were disabled in this one particular area to enable the cartels to do more of their work efficiently. So, and then they'll just discard you when they're done. And then another case that really just broke my heart was a young mom named Daniela, and she had 3 kids, and her middle son, Axel, had gone out one night. He was about 16, and he had a girlfriend he wanted to go and see and give her a present to. It was a new girlfriend, and she really didn't want him to go, but he really wanted to go, and it wasn't sort of far away from where they were living in this village, and he disappeared. And she said that they were able to find footage of him and sort of saw that it was this one guy, in a hoodie, who was part of a union cartel, which is a big cartel in Mexico City, and they basically will take young kids to be their drug mules because they're much sort of less conspicuous than older people. So they'll often forcibly recruit children as they are to do this work. And then that was 4 or 5 years ago, and just, how demoralizing the search has been for her to be able to not get support. They're laughed at by police, and it's heartbreaking because, she's there. And when I come in, she's wearing a T-shirt that she'd made where she'd screen printed her son's photograph on it, because she just, whatever she can do to try to bring some sense of awareness. And again, this is never going to be headline news because it is so common in Mexico for this to happen. And then a lot of the time, of these people, a lot of them, they might be American citizens, or and yet, I just remember looking at that and thinking, this is no different to the hostage situation that was happening in Gaza. But this doesn't make the news, and nobody cares. And why don't people care?
And this is in our own hemisphere.
This is in our
neighbor.
Border. Yeah.
And a lot of people are Mexican immigrants here. They're, full U.S. citizens that live in America but have family in Mexico.
Yeah.
This is something that American citizens care about.
Yeah. And you just see the helplessness and the desperation and I remember, Jacqueline, who's kind of leading one of these collectives, and I remember she sort of looked at me as I was leaving, and she said, nobody's ever come to ask me for my story or to interview me or to tell a story. I mean, that just tore me up because, they tore me up because I just thought these people really are so forgotten by their country, by our country, by the media, by sort of the commonality of what they're dealing with. And again, to me, being disappeared by these cartels, that's no different to what Hamas has done to the hostages. But it doesn't get attention.
And you're a mother. You're a relatively new mother, right? You're just a young girl, right?
Yeah, she just turned 2.
Yeah, so you're still a new mother, but this is, through the lens of somebody that's been, at war for a long time at this point. How do you go from reporting a story like that where you're talking to mothers who that heartbreak that is just so palpable? Anytime you've met somebody that has lost a child too young, especially to something horrific like that, it impacts you. To be able to go, how do you do a reporting trip like that and then come home and, be mom?
Yeah. It's hard sometimes, and this particular trip, I went off to do my work, but my husband came with Raven and they were staying in Mexico City. So, we were, tagging on some family things at the end. And so in some ways I was grateful that she was close to me, unlike a lot of the reporting trips where I feel I'm so far away. But you just have to come home and just, love your child deeper, because it is helpless. You feel very, very helpless. And in some ways, I think being a writer is cathartic, because at least you feel that you can tell their story. And I think, I have so much admiration for, say, photographers, and because they take these photos of whether it be war, whether it be a mom missing her child. And I think that there's not always a way to place that feeling, or I'm very grateful to be a writer in that way. But you come home and you just have to love deeper, because there's nothing else you can do.
How has this career impacted you family wise? I mean, we're both about the same age here.
Yeah.
It's, you didn't have kids until recently and all these things. Was that a plan? Did you, is everything that is the life that you've led been the way that you thought it would go?
I don't know. I think in my 20s, late 20s, I think I remember there sort of being a crossroads point in my life where, I had been doing this sort of work and I was deeply in love with it, and I felt as though there wasn't anything else I wanted to do, but also knowing that I wanted to be a mom. And I think I remember being at the crossroads where, I was in a relationship where my partner at the time, was very keen to have a family, and I knew I wanted that. But at the same time, I just knew I couldn't. I just felt that there was still things that I had to do that I just knew that I would never be able to do once I'd had children, hence living in Afghanistan, things like that just wouldn't have been possible. So so it was a crossroads. It was sort of a turning point, I think, where I had to just kind of go full speed into doing the work that I felt that I wanted to and needed to do. But while always knowing that, I certainly couldn't have imagined my life not being a mom.
Yeah.
But getting there is a different point, especially when you're not in one place for a very long time. I'm grateful to have, met my husband, and then, I wasn't at that point planning to have a child right then, but that's what happened. And
you're one of the, I feel like few, I don't have numbers to quantify this, but you and I both know so many people that go into this line of work, they go their whole life, either they don't live a long life because this line of work has a way of
consuming you.
And, a lot of people meet an early demise, either from a variety of reasons, not always combat, but many times combat. And the ones that do make it, they're consumed by the work. They're either divorced or they just never got married. Maybe they're a parent, but maybe their kids don't even really know them. And, it's really hard, I mean, you and I both know people like this. And, I feel, you did it a lot longer than I did, but I feel like we both made that choice of like, maybe enough is enough. Maybe not that there's not something that still calls to you to go do this kind of work, but that, I don't want to be, like, for me, I don't want to be an absent father. I want my kids to know who I am and have a relationship with me. And I also hate the idea of them ever being orphaned. Because I couldn't say when. I had to keep going, keep the next best story, the next war. The wars are perpetual, unfortunately.
Yeah, they are. And I think, so sort of thrown into the ring, wasn't planned, but certainly welcomed. And becoming a mom, everything does shift, and there's certainly a grapple with identity, because it's very hard to still feel like I'm a mom, but I'm a war reporter, but I'm, how am I going to make this work? But there is just such a depth of love that I didn't realize was possible until becoming a mom. I mean, you can love your partner, you can love your parents, your siblings, but the love you have for a child is just something that is just so out of this world. And I'm so grateful to be able to experience that. And because there is just nothing like it. And it certainly, I mean, it has to influence the way that you do work and the way you see the world. And I think I was always somebody with a lot of compassion for people, but I think becoming a mom does take that to, a very, I think, different level.
And there's, I know this is something that my own wife goes through, but it's elevated when you're dealing with matters of life and death. But this thing of, as a woman, I think you are presented with this unique challenge that most men don't have to face.
Yeah.
Most men don't have to think about, am I a father or do I have a career?
Yeah.
Most men, it's just, of course I have a career.
Men are not asked how they balance parenthood and
exactly
their career.
Like it is inherent that you will have a career and you will go to work and you will do those things and you will sort of be as present as you can be or are willing to be as a father. Whereas women, it's like, oh, you're a mother first, and then how do you balance the career and everything? That and I think women, like, it's not only just societal pressure. I think women put that pressure on themselves too, of like, you feel that strong line of like, I love my kids, but also I want to go
and
do
I also
meaningful work.
And I also believe that one of the biggest gifts that I can give my daughter, is knowing that I am going out to do something that I'm passionate about and that I feel is important, and I want her to be able to, one day be able to sit and discuss some of the things I've done, and her to, to feel that and feel that a lot of what I'm doing is because I want her to grow up with this different sense of understanding, I guess. So, but it is very conflicted because, on one hand, I think it's so admirable for women to stay at home with their children and to give their kids that presence, and that's really something that isn't valued in society the way that it should be. But at the same time, I also recognize that path isn't for me, but it's in constant conflict. And certainly, there are times when I look back and, wondered, should I, have more kids? Should I have done this earlier? Should I, when it was much easier? Was it worth it? And sometimes I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Because I look at envy a little bit, with people that do have these large families, and I think that's just, a really beautiful thing as well. But I have to accept that that's not this life.
Yeah, and it's not like you could pinpoint some experience you would trade for that or some, it's not that simple. It's not that clean.
Yeah.
It's you just kind of, you have to wonder.
Yeah.
Everybody plays the what if game. And, and like I said, I think specifically, I mean, a lot of women struggle with career versus mothering, but for you, the stakes are so high, and it's not just a career. It's your impact. You're telling stories for people that otherwise would not have anybody to advocate for them. Not that journalism is advocacy. I want to be careful with how I frame that. But you're telling important stories that the world needs to hear in order to do anything about anything. You're putting yourself at great personal risk in many of these situations, maybe not every single one. I know you're not out dodging bullets like every single day out there, but like certainly it's an inherently risky thing. But at the same time, it's like, how do you balance that with family and doing all of that? It's just, it's really hard. But,
it is really hard. And people, you're out and people, questioning you, what have you done lately? What's been this? And my heart always skips a beat, because it's sort of like, well, my priority is my child, and I work, I do as much as I can, obviously being at home, I don't think there's too many people that can survive on one income. So I'm definitely working around the clock. But then when it comes to travel, I've got to be very strategic about it. I have to, we don't have family close by, so I have to be very strategic about trying to get Raven to my in-laws who live quite a distance, and then planning my trip. I don't have the luxury to kind of hang out at a border and, well, maybe I can cross next week. Maybe, those
things. I know this life.
Yes,
it's like, I got a schedule here, guys. We got to make this happen.
I got to be in and I got to be out. So anything that's like a little wishy-washy, I'm like, I can't take that risk, because I can't afford to get on a plane and be away from my child if I'm not going to get this. So it does limit you a little bit in that way. again, I think definitely been.
And that's hard in war zones.
It is.
A lot of this reporting happens because you're just there for months at a time.
And the story finally breaks.
Yeah. It's hard when you're like, I got a 2-week window to do this because we got stuff going up, or that's how long I have childcare. I absolutely empathize with this. And I used to be, you wonder, right? You play the what if game. I used to think like, gosh, what if I would have started doing this before I had kids or something like that? And I could just go over for 2, 3, 4 months and really get in the weeds.
And just, live in these places. And now, you're very...
What could I have done? Yeah. What stories could I have gotten?
So I think the nature of how I approach it certainly shifted in that way. And then I've never... I mean, sometimes, yes, you end up in the right place, but I've never been fixated on breaking news. I kind of did my share of that. And to me, it's finding maybe the more hidden stories, the ones that definitely aren't.
Like these Mexico stories. Like, where can people read? Have you published those stories?
So it's part of a book that I just sort of turned in the draft manuscript. And then on my Substack too, I've published sort of anecdotes about that.
Yeah, I really want to read more about that because again, it's very relevant too. It's happening here in the Western Hemisphere. It's our neighbor. These things, sex trafficking, human trafficking, they affect more than just Mexico. It happens right here in the United States. These are things that are really, really important. If you're doing that reporting on that, that's something that people should be reading.
And Mexico really is one of my, somewhere that I really want, I guess one of my favorite places to work of all the places. Worst
food poisoning I've ever had in my life was Mexico City.
I've been lucky. I think I've escaped it, but
I'll tell you a quick story. Yeah. I was filming a show for the History Channel and we were going around to all these different places that Lee Harvey Oswald was. It was called JFK Declassified. Okay. So you're following all these documents. And so Lee Harvey Oswald spent a bunch of time in Mexico City trying to get into the Russian embassy, or did go in there. They just didn't take him seriously. Yeah. And anyways, cool thing for me. I got to go spend a bunch of time in Mexico City. I'd never been before. Had no idea, I don't know why, that Mexico City was up in the mountains, and it's actually a high altitude. Yeah. It's like a Denver. It's actually, I think, higher than Denver. And just all these different things. Had a blast there.
Oh, it's the coolest place.
This was 2016. 2016. It was, I'm fumbling on the year here, but we were there the night of the election that Donald Trump was elected the first time. Mm. And if you remember, during that election, nobody actually thought he was going to win.
I was in Baghdad at the time. Yeah. The same sentiment.
If you remember, like, Mexico was a big part of that campaign. It was a lot about it. But anyways, we're sitting here in the hotel room. Me and the whole production crew were all in one hotel room, like watching the coverage. And like the reality is, I was like, holy shit,
God,
like,
what Florida just happened?
Florida went red. All these different states started going like, holy shit, I think Trump is going to win. Yeah. Like, holy shit. And we're in Mexico where that was a very
divisive.
So anyways, we're glued to the TV and not going to sleep that night because we're going to stay up and watch the election coverage all night. I think we had just wrapped shooting. Yeah, because we were going to the airport the next day. We had just wrapped shooting, so we were going to stay up and watch the election all night. We didn't want to go out to eat or anything like that, but there was, at the hotel we were staying at, there was like I want to call it a gas station. It wasn't. It was more like a bodega, like a little convenience type store. I'm like, I'm just going to run across the street and get some, like, whatever they have, right? I go in there. They've got like some hot dogs on the thing. I grab a couple of these hot dogs. I come back. I eat them. And it was like within an hour, I start to feel like, I don't feel well. Like I've got some like heartburn and stuff. I progressively start to feel worse and worse and worse. The next morning, we have to be up at like 4 a.m. I think we all got like an hour or two of sleep to head to the Mexico City airport and get on a flight to Miami for the next week of filming some stuff out there. And it just gets progressively worse and worse and worse to the point where I have some really unpleasant trips to the bathroom there. No. And then we get on a flight. I wasn't in first class or anything like that. I wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah. And I'm just like, at that point, I'm at that point where I like can't see straight because I'm so sick. And fortunately, my co-star is a guy named Bob Baer. He did have a first class seat. He gave it to me in the line up there. And I lost track at like 12 times. I'm up in this first class seat. Thank God he gave that to me, because if I would have been in economy, like in the lines that form for those bathrooms, Holly. It would have been a really uncomfortable thing.
It's always my fear flying home is getting food poisoning the day before.
Exactly. And you got that. We end up getting to Miami. I end up missing like the first 2 days of filming in Miami because I was literally in my hotel room with an IV and trying to rehydrate me. I'd lost so much water. And it was like, it had to have been the hot dogs.
Yeah.
Like, in the fucking election and hot dogs and Mexico. And you tell this story to people down there, like, dude, why are you getting gas station hot dogs in Mexico City? Of all the things that you could get.
I would kind of say anywhere, to be honest.
Yeah, generally speaking,
Mexico City for sure.
Yeah, and it's just like, probably wasn't the smartest thing.
Such great food in Mexico City. Oh my gosh.
I had some of the best, best food.
Yeah.
It was great. Some of those neighborhoods there were just like party atmosphere, like not party like just, you're 19. That's what we
love about
it.
Yeah,
really awesome. They've got the
mariachi bands. Everybody's having a good time. You know, people are just there's a happy spirit about it.
Oh, it is.
People with nothing, they're still happy.
And we were there during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. So we got that. That opening scene in that James Bond movie. Yep. Have you seen it where he's like during the Day of the Dead celebrations in Mexico City? Doesn't look like that in real life. That was much more cinematic. But we were there during those celebrations, and that was so cool.
Yeah, that's
like of all the times, my first time in Mexico City.
Oh, I've worked with somebody. I love it. I go back any day of the week. I love all of Mexico. I could just. So many fascinating stories there that are so untold. And Mexican journalists are some of the bravest.
Oh
my goodness. You know, prior to the war in Gaza and in Ukraine, it was the most dangerous place for a journalist to work. And that was not because bombs were going to be falling, on your house.
It was
because you're going to get disappeared. And it's not just when you're exposing cartel, you're exposing government.
Mm-hmm.
The corruption, the other things, you're very much in jeopardy. And so Mexican journalists are so much respect, so incredibly brave and they don't get, the credence for the work that they do.
No, I was glad to see they were, did you ever watch that Netflix series Narcos?
My husband loves that sort of, I've watched a little bit. I struggle with violent movies and TV shows, but he loves it. So I've seen bits and pieces sort of from watching it with him.
They featured one of the characters in there is a Mexican reporter, or maybe it's a Colombian reporter.
Yeah.
I forget what.
They're all blended
There's a
into
different
one, right?
season.
Yeah.
The first season is very much following the Colombian cartels and all of that. And then later ones it's into Mexico. So I forget which season it happened in, but they featured a reporter and I was really glad to see that because they really framed how dangerous that work was.
And it is.
Again, they don't get the credit. They really don't. But you bring up Ukraine. You were there as well. I mean, there's not really I feel like, Holly, there's not really a war you haven't seen in the past 10, 15 years. If it was going on, it feels like you almost had a hand in it somewhere. And we haven't even talked about Myanmar and some of the stuff that's going on there. You've got a wide body of work. But Ukraine, you were there during like Bakhmut was one of the heaviest bombed.
Close to that was in toward the end of 2022. So shortly before Wagner Group actually took it over when there was sort of the assault on the city.
Yeah. One, why did you want to go to Ukraine? Was it just because it was the next war or?
No, I think, there was obviously still a lot of interest in what was happening. And then, second to that, just the opportunities present themselves, I think. And being an independent journalist at that time, just having that ability to be able to kind of pick and choose, and so that was still somewhere that was very compelling. Having spent time there in the invasion and during those initial couple of months after that, you don't want to forget a place. So I certainly wanted to go back, and I'd been to many other places in between those trips, but. Yeah, definitely knew that I wanted to go back and keep following that story, and the opportunities sort of came, I guess, to be a little bit under the radar. And I was able to get access to the area, which journalists were not allowed into at that time because of the sort of the severity of the fighting. So I was able to kind of go with some, an NGO that was doing some evacuation work. So I think, I just felt like that was an important story to tell, and that opportunity came.
Yeah, I want to look up here just to put it in context for people what was going on in Bakhmut.
I mean, it was wild. It felt like the Wild West. Absolutely. Just Yeah. I mean, so I look back at some of the videos, I guess, from that time and just, yeah, I guess I don't know how calm. I was completely calm in all of it, but I look back now, I think as a mom again, and you'll sort of, my gosh, I didn't, yeah. But my heart was definitely in my mouth for a lot of it.
They're saying it was the bloodiest battle since World War II.
Wow.
I mean, and that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
Because there's been some pretty horrible battles since World War II around the world. And it began in the shelling began in May 2022. And it just became this battleground, again, largely led by Wagner and supported by Russian troops. And
I mean, it was really just epicenter of a lot of the fighting at that time, and just, it was a strange situation because you still had families that were living there sort of in the rubble. There's no water, there's no electricity. And yet you still had families that refused to leave. And, old ladies that were in their 90s that had lived there their entire life and refused to leave. Why should I leave now? This is my home and this is where I'm going to stay. And there was certainly, there's a lot of discomfort with that because you knew, at that point, winter was around the corner and it was already a lot of heavy snow, but you knew that they would kind of get to this point where these elderly ladies living alone, they're not going to be able to knock the snow down, shovel the snow from their front yard, and that's just going to continue to pile up. And then what happens? Then they're completely just boxed into their home. So it was interesting in that, the reasons for people staying. And I think at that time, a lot of the people that were left, I think, were more sympathetic to the Russian side. So they felt in some ways maybe more comfortable staying. But I remember there was even one, I guess, convenience store, this little shop that was still open, and everything else had been obliterated. And, the shop just had like some perishable stuff, chocolate bars and water bottles and things. And going in there, and, the half the shop is just demolished, but, the other half, the guys there working, and walking in there, and he's, blaming the Ukrainians and sort of like, do you see where the incoming fire is coming from? But I guess these people were just so set in their ways that they couldn't change their minds. And I think it really highlights war isn't just about the actual fighting that's happening. What you see is the way that just every system shuts down. Like, we have the ability to, say, call 911 if there's an emergency, or to turn to the police or turn to a hospital, whatever that may be. And you just see that in war, you lose all of that. You're really on your own, and there's no rule of law anymore. I remember in one case, this sort of family called us up. I guess, they thought we were some sort of, rescue team, which we weren't, but called us up, in this obliterated building. And there was an old man who'd been dead in that building for, I think at that point it was 9 days, and his own cats were eating his face, and he'd been hacked to death with an axe. What we believe to be some sort of dispute that happened with neighbors, that maybe they'd gotten drunk and that, he'd essentially been murdered by someone else, probably the people that told us to go, that he was up there. I wouldn't be surprised. So you're seeing this really horrific, graphic situation. And then, we went to the kind of police department that was a little while away and hidden behind a gate. And again, there's so much incoming fire at this point. Like, and the police just sort of shrugged and said, we're not going out there. Like, these people don't like us. And you just see, again, you sort of are reminded of that there is no rule of law, that there is no justice or accountability that's going to happen, and there isn't the resources to do that. So there's so much to be lost in war, I think.
Yeah, and that's not specific to Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I was just looking it up, the Battle of Bakhmut. They say upwards of 100,000 people in a single battle.
Yeah.
I mean, that definitely puts it in elite territory as far as how bloody. I just, that, experiencing that incoming and the missiles and stuff, I often tell people there's a real big difference between, ballistic missiles and the sort of rockets, mortars, that sort of thing that you'd find in the Middle East wars.
Yeah.
Did you find that it was a little bit unnerving being in this wasn't an insurgency sort of fight or a counterinsurgency. This was nation on nation shelling ballistic missiles.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly, you feel very vulnerable, I think. It felt very medieval, I think, in so many ways too, because you really, it was a very traditional war at that time. And you really, and this is something I think you learn over time, and it certainly has saved me in many conflict situations, is intuition. And I remember one day being in Bakhmut, and with the teams I was with, so there were sort of two vehicles. One was a van that fit more, and then the rest of us were kind of in an SUV. And none of this is armored or anything, by the way. So you're just kind of going.
Not that armored vehicles help you a whole lot in some of these.
But you're just going with it, basically. I think I was the only one who actually wore my helmet too. I think everyone else was just in a vest and like whatever at this point. But again, intuition. I remember being in Bakhmut, and there's a lot of action, a lot of shelling, and then so we would sort of be traveling, with these two vehicles, and then and I just remember kind of saying to the driver of the vehicle, like, we just should go now. Like, there's no reason to be here. We've done what we need to do today. The sun's going down. Like, it's almost dark. Let's like get out of here a little bit. And the other vehicle was sort of, I guess, had stopped and waited for us. And then we kept going. And, there was a couple of people that were struggling. I was like, no. Now's the time. Go. Let's just go. It's just that alarm system in your brain. And so the van that we were traveling with is, parked. And so finally we catch up with them, get the stragglers. We go, literally turn around, and a bomb hits that exact position where that van was sitting 30 seconds later. And I just think to myself, oh my God, like, had that straggler that I was yelling at sort of been any longer, like, what would have happened? And so, and I felt like every day in Bakhmut felt like that a little bit, that you're really living on luck in so many ways, and you have so much luck until luck runs out. And that's why I'm always very in touch with my intuition, because I feel like it served me in many places in my life. And sometimes you feel stupid because there's no rhyme or reason to why you're thinking a certain thing. But it's there.
Yeah, I believe in intuition. I specifically believe in a mother's intuition about her child and things like that. And certainly intuition in war zones and conflict areas, specifically Bakhmut, though. Had you ever, of all the places you've been, was that kind of unique in the sort of the brand of warfare that you saw?
Yes, it was unique. You do have that. Yeah, very.
I can't think of any other, reading over sort of the places you've reported from. I can't think of another area you may have been exposed to that sort of, again, that brand of warfare.
Most wars these days, are usually against some form of an insurgency or a separatist group or a terrorist group, whatever you want to call
Proxy
it, a militia.
Yeah.
So Ukraine is Bakhmut certainly unique in that it was two nation states, two neighbors that were just. Yeah.
The two biggest land armies in Europe.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people forget that is Russia and Ukraine are the number one and number two biggest armies in Europe.
Yeah.
And when those are, going on, again, it's something that we haven't seen since World War II.
Yeah.
And not in Europe anyways. And that's kind of what I ask is like the motivation, what brought you over there? Because for me, my desire to go over there, it was almost like a sense of history. It's like if I call myself a conflict reporter or journalist and I don't go, what might be one of the most consequential wars?
Yeah.
And, I can't predict the future, but it's certainly the most consequential war in a long time as far as scale, stakes, things like that. I don't know if I could live with myself if I didn't do something.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
again, I certainly was not in a situation like Bakhmut. I was in, I've talked about it before on here. I won't rehash everything, but I was in Lviv. I was getting a coffee every day. And, it was, I don't want to say that danger wasn't present.
Lviv got some pretty big hits though, especially in those early days. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. And I was there for a few of those things. But again, I don't want to compare my experience to what you experienced in Bakhmut or what a lot of people have experienced in Kyiv, or certainly in the more eastern regions, the Donbass and places like that. That is really dystopian stuff. When you like some of the pictures that come out of that, it's like if you put a black and white filter on it, you'd think it was straight out of World War I.
Absolutely. And like the kidnapping of children into these, Russian re-education camps and sort of changing their identities and this sort of medieval torture that the Russians are doing. And it's hard to wrap your head around this happening in, this current day and age of how is this still happening? And
you think that we've moved beyond it as a species, as humanity, but then there's just time and time again examples of we haven't moved beyond this.
I mean,
we think that we have in places like America, but like you saw what ISIS did in the Middle East. You see what the Chinese are doing with minority groups in Western China. You see what Russia does. You see what cartels are doing. I mean, the stories that you've reported on some of the most violent humans on earth, implicated in these things. But the fact that they exist in the 21st century, that this brand of violence, like mass violence, the fact that it exists still, that we haven't moved beyond it, especially when it's so reprehensible to anybody. That's like some of the people that are perpetrating these things, like their mothers and fathers. Sure. They're like, how are you like? And I think about this all the time too. I look back at my time in the military, and I didn't have kids. I wasn't married. I was married my last deployment. Correction, I got married right between my 4th and 5th deployments, but did not have kids. And I look back on that and the guys that I deployed with, and I'm like, God, how did you do this with kids back home? And I'm not saying that we were out committing war crimes or anything like that, but like it's a violent job, and you just, and there's a lot of danger and all these things. And like, just how do you do that? And then for people that take it a step farther and do, like I said, commit war crimes and stuff and do things, it's just, I don't know. I mean, how do you do it? I guess the real answer is already out there. A lot of these guys will deal with moral injury the rest of their life. They'll have to deal with the repercussions of their decisions for the rest of their life. And the victims of these things that survive, that were not so fortunate to die in many of these situations, the most terrible tragedy, I think, sometimes is living through these things and having to live with those memories for the rest of your life. It's, that's what will happen. How does it happen? Well, it happens, it happens, and then you have to think about that and live with that for the rest of your life. Yeah. And that's really tough.
It is tough.
Why do we do that to ourselves?
Yeah. And that's why it brings me back to, there's not enough thought that goes into preventing wars and what it means to go to war, and to send people to war. Like, a million Russians have died in this war.
And a lot of them plucked from the furthest regions of Russia that don't even know, have never stepped a foot in Moscow. These aren't people in
Moscow or St. Petersburg. And people that, and no one that's going to rattle the Putin cage in any way. These are people on the fringes of society.
Yeah, often. Russia's a very big country. It envelops a lot of what you would traditionally think of as like Asian sort of territory. You see a lot of the Russians killed in Ukraine. They look like
it's guttering.
They don't look like what you think a Russian looks like. Because they're from
Siberia. They're from they're conscripted. They've had often no very
indigenous,
no fighting experience. They're thrown into a front line.
A front line that is, by every sense of the word, an absolute meat grinder.
Yeah, and there is zero. I think, care or recognition from Putin about what he's done to his own people. And then, of course, in Russia, you don't have that ability to speak out. And if you do, you'll find yourself with a long jail sentence. So it's a tough place to be in, because at the end of the day, only Russians can get rid of Putin, really. but it's a very difficult
no
climate to do
country.
that. Yeah.
And I agree with this, right? Because I'm not anxious to get into a world war with
Certainly
Russia.
not, right.
I don't want to be in this situation where it's like America and the UK against Russia and China. Like none of us want that.
No.
But I mean, that's not good for anybody. So
Yeah.
you're right. It's like without a straight up, doing something that would provoke an actual World War III. That's what that would be. It's got to be on Russians to do that. And step one of that is Russians have to think what's going on is not right and not good, to the point that they're willing to do some extraordinary things. And I wonder if that's the case, because you do see a lot of interviews with Russians where the propaganda machine is real.
It totally is
over there.
Yeah.
It really is.
And it's a shame. I spent a winter in Russia about 8 years ago now. And what a great place. Like they're just culture vultures, the music, the opera, the ballet, the people, which is, and, being surprised, because often when we think of Russia as, as a cultural stereotype of kind of being, flat and not into just the warmest, funniest, wasn't the sort of the cold stereotype that we tend to think. Just the loveliest people. And that is really sad that, that we don't, that they'll never, we'll never get to kind of experience that part of it, at least while this war is happening.
I've never been to Russia, and I am sad about that, because I do wonder, like, one of the, like, a bucket list thing for me is I want to ride the Trans-Siberian Railway from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. I've wanted to do that for forever. And I really do wonder, like, is that really going to be possible in my lifetime? Because I wouldn't feel comfortable going to Russia today.
No, absolutely not. And I wouldn't either. And that's, again, it's such a shame that is what's transpired. And I remember being at a dinner one time with some Russians, they were lovely people. And one of them kind of, asked me, why is it that Russians are always the bad guys in American films? And I thought about it and I thought, I guess they are.
It's not just Russians. It's that's an interesting way to frame that question, right? Because when you think about who the bad guys are in American films, it's almost always not Russians. It's Eastern Europeans that fell under the Soviet, and that framing of that is Russians thinking that is all Russia,
right?
When it's not. It is the Czech Republic. It is it is Ukraine. It is all these different places, Romania. Hungary, those aren't Russia.
Yeah.
Those are their own people. And a lot of times these ones, they're always this like Eastern European, I feel like Ukrainian, honestly, is the more common person that comes up. But I think that's one of the problems is, and I'm not saying anything against those specific people, or that they had, I'm sure, like you say, they were probably perfectly lovely people. I don't think all Russians are bad people by any stretch. Just like any country, I don't think all Arabs or Muslims are bad or whatever.
And people aren't their government.
It's too big of a country.
Yeah.
Too big of a country for everybody to be bad. It's just not. Yeah. There are bad people there. There are people that are very vocally in support of what is happening.
Absolutely, and that's
Ukraine.
Terrifying.
I don't think that those are people that are necessarily the type of people that I would call good, but there's a lot of good people over there.
Yeah, and I think that's anywhere. People are not their governments.
Exactly.
And we can't equate entire populations to their governments,
especially when you get a guy that like doesn't hold elections and
just
like a guy like Putin is not, it's not easy on those people either. A lot of those people, when we put sanctions on Russia and things like that, it's not Putin that's suffering. It's the people that are suffering when they can't get food and things like that. By the way, I'm not saying don't sanction Russia and things. I'm just saying it's like Putin's not the guy that suffers.
Don't feel it. They're not going to feel this.
Exactly. The worst thing that happened to them was I think a couple of yachts got repossessed in the Mediterranean. Come on. But yeah, it's really tragic. Just shifting. I feel like I'm just playing like bingo with all the places you've been around the world, but I'm so fascinated. You've just been able to see such a wide swath of the world and oftentimes this sort of dirty underbelly of it, but really wonderful stories. I want to go over to Myanmar or, that there is so much history there, and I'm a little bit connected there. One of my really good friends, he grew up, his name's Luke Ryan. He grew up in a missionary family. He actually grew up in Pakistan. He was involved in a school shooting in Pakistan. This is back in the 90s. Horrible. But his family has shifted from Southwest Asia over to Southeast Asia, primarily in Myanmar, and helping the Karen people over there and providing medical care. And his dad's a doctor, providing that medical care and all of that. And he's actually made the trek from, I believe it's Thailand.
He's with a missionary group?
He's gone on some of the resupply missions and stuff like that. Luke, my friend, I worked with him at Black Rifle. He's a former Army Ranger, and now I would call him a media mogul.
Yeah, amazing.
But done some really great things. But he filmed a documentary, basically going to meet up with his parents, going from, I want to say it was Thailand into Myanmar. Yep. Does Thailand share a border with Myanmar?
Yes, that's how I went to Myanmar through Thailand.
So this is
that's
not crazy.
That's where the Karen people are.
I was questioning whether it was Thailand or not, but that's went in there to go meet up and really showing that. But the Karen people, the town that I grew up in, I grew up in Huron, South Dakota. That's where a bunch of the Karen people were relocated to as refugees. And so as a teenager, I started to see people that my dad worked with was very much a blue collar guy. He worked at the railroad and packing plants and things like that. And some of the guys that he worked with there, they've got slits across their throat because they survived mass executions and things like that. So I grew up with some of those people there. And then you look even further back, like I said, my time in the military is in the 75th Ranger Regiment. The Ranger Regiment draws its lineage from Merrill's Marauders, which was in the China-Burma India theater. The people that they worked by, through, and with were the Karens. They were the scouts. They were the ones that showed them the ways through the jungle, all this other stuff. So there's all these, I've never been, but there's all these facets of my life, from the people I know to the people my dad worked with in the town that I was raised in, to the military unit I was in that shares lineage there, for a place that I think to most Americans, they probably couldn't point to Myanmar on a map. Right. It's almost, I think to most people, almost like this random country. But for me, at some point I need to get there because it just feels like it has been in my life in so many different ways. All that being said, all that preamble to say, what was it like? What were the stories you were doing there? It's such an incredible group of people that you were over there with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't spent a huge amount of time, so I certainly can't take credit for being any kind of expert, but I spent some time there. It was about 6 or 7 years ago now. And again, sort of sneaking over the Thailand border into the area where it was sort of predominantly Karen people. And there's been, a lot of conflict ongoing with the Burmese military, the Junta there. And again, just such a huge level of
And to be clear here, this is the government persecuting ethnic minorities. So you have
a military dictatorship that's ruling the country. And it's crazy. And one thing that always fascinated me about that situation is you have this sort of Buddhist army. And I think a lot of our, maybe naive understanding of Buddhism is, peaceful and prayer and nonviolence. And so it's sort of wrapping your head around how is this predominantly Buddhist military doing such atrocious things. And I'm talking about throwing babies into fires and just the sexual violence, the absolute just indiscriminate killing without a second thought, in the most brutal of ways. And I think it comes down to what I think Myanmar really taught me was what it comes down to is any time you have a sort of, I guess, a superiority of one group over another, you are able to convince yourself that what you're doing is right. So
absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
And so, when you go down the path of a junta, you are then disconnected from the rest of society and you see what you're doing as being morally good because that is what you're taught. That is what you're brainwashed to believe. And so you go about your day really believing that you have that moral good. And so that's why I do think that anytime we get into absolutes about anything, religion, ethnicities, whatever it is that where it's a dangerous path because Myanmar is an absolute example of that. And
just to bring this home for people here, you think that this is a thing that happens in far off lands that you haven't heard of or whatever, where those absolutes can be drawn. If you're somebody that has ever said, all conservatives are evil, or
Yes.
all liberals are evil, all MAGA are evil, all Christians are evil, all Muslims are evil, all Mexicans are evil,
Yeah.
all insert any political, all homeless people are evil, all drug dealers are bad. Like any absolute, like you said, there's examples we can draw to right here that if we didn't have the checks and balances that we have right now, it could happen here too.
Absolutely.
You know? Like people need to be aware that, like, yeah, we're talking about the junta and the Karen people.
And you dehumanize any sort of group or population, and that's how genocides, that's how war, that's how these crimes against humanity, that's how they begin, is dehumanization. And we certainly have seen that for decades in Burma. That has been ongoing for a very long time. And again, there's not really political will to change that in any way, shape, or form. Certainly there has been efforts, by different administrations over the years, but you've got proxy elements of China and Russia arming these groups. These weapons don't.
If you care about everything, you care about nothing. Yeah. You can't give everything equal weight, and it's just heartbreaking because these are still human beings.
Yeah, it is. And funnily enough, where Afghanistan used to be kind of the poppy central of the world, or where, I think 90-something% of the world's heroin came from Afghanistan. The Taliban actually has, made strides to crack down on that. I'm sure it still exists, but that sort of hub has actually moved to more of that Golden Triangle area, which certainly implicates.
I think that's where the majority of the world's heroin comes from now.
So Myanmar is now the hub for the world's heroin. So again, that's also another funding.
Again, if we're talking war on drugs, it's bigger than just Latin America.
Yeah, it's certainly, that's a big target area for that. And again, Chinese has interests, Russia has interests. And I've certainly seen no indication from the current administration that it's going to be a focal point of interest. So again, I think it's just, that's why these militia groups have to rise up, and they feel as though they're on their own and they have to defend themselves.
I definitely feel like I agree with people who are like, we need to fix problems at home first. Like, we've spent so much time thinking about it everywhere else, and we've got a lot of issues here at home. And I agree with that. Also, like, yes, and like, I agree with that. Also, I think that we need to vigorously support democratic efforts anywhere in the world, and like, the fights that we should be on the right side of are the ones where it is the small people fighting for their freedom, because that's ultimately the DNA of what this country is. And so we need to vigorously support that anywhere, whether that's Ukraine or the Karen in Myanmar, or Tibetans against China, any of these other places. Do we need to put boots on the ground and all that other stuff? No, I'm not saying that, but we should do. We have we have ambassadors, we have a very robustly funded State Department, all these other things. We have people all over the world. Those people that are responsible for those areas of the world should be empowered to make decisions that further freedom and democracy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Further those American ideals in whatever part of the world that they exist.
Yeah.
So that's like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. military has to come in and get involved in the jungles of Myanmar. That's not what I'm advocating for. But there should be a sort of just thesis statement that we have about how we approach these sorts of things around the world. And it's like, hey, we support whoever is on the side of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, democratic ideals, American ideals.
And I think what I've witnessed a lot, in America, and maybe this is just amplified by social media, is a disconnect from compassion, a disconnect from understanding that, again, empathy, compassion, these are not finite resources. And I don't know how or where this happened, but I feel like there is so much disconnect between how many Americans feel and what is happening in a lot of these places. And I don't understand how we've gotten to this place of, I just don't understand how you can look at a child, being bombed, burned and bombed and under rubble or whatever the story may be, and not feel something, not feel like that is wrong.
It's complex emotions. You should be capable of saying, no, I do not want my country. I don't want to send my kids to go fight over there. Also, it is horrible what is happening. And I have all the empathy and sympathy in the world. And I hope that they get help.
Yeah.
I hope that we can find a way to help without putting ourselves into a really bad situation.
And in the very least, shut up.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have anything constructive to add to the conversation,
you don't have to have an opinion on everything.
Shut up. Yeah. Stay off the Instagram, whatever.
Yeah, which that's probably part of the problem with Myanmar is that I don't ever see any hot takes on Myanmar on Instagram.
And this is not just Myanmar. This is just any war in general. Just like
I wish there was some hot takes on Myanmar because that would mean some people were paying attention.
Yeah.
You know, more than, like I said, I see it very personally through my friend Luke and his family and what they do in that area and how many years and years they have spent in that region and the history I've looked into and the people I've met firsthand.
Beautiful people.
Amazing people. I mean, anybody that comes from the jungles of Burma, the jungles of Myanmar, to the plains of South Dakota and deals with that. Remember those temperature swings I was telling you about? You go from humid jungle to like 50 below zero in the winter, and that's where they're just going to set up shop and make a new life and do right by their families and all that sort of stuff. And assimilate into an area that is largely dominated by Norwegian immigrants and a very different way of doing everything and dealing with. I remember there was, I don't know whether they were true or not, but like also it's like, oh, they're stealing the cats and eating them and all this other stuff.
In Ohio.
And it was just like, no, that was happening in like Huron, South Dakota. That was a rumor. I don't know if that was true or not. But some of these people, they're literally coming straight out of the jungle. Of course, they don't necessarily know all of our customs or tradition.
Assimilation process.
Exactly. There was some problems with, like, I know they'd be moved into houses and they would like, they didn't know how to use a stove or anything like that. So they would like make a fire in their living room and cut a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. And it was like, well, that's how you cook, right? Like how come this place doesn't have a fireplace to cook, And so things like that. And so I think it was a real rough go for them. But then you go back now, and this is, 10, 15 years later on that a lot of these people came into my hometown and they very much assimilated. I was just back recently and talking to somebody that I grew up with who's involved in, city council and all that sort of stuff. And they're becoming part of the town's leadership. They are making a big impact. And these are all people, they escaped the horror that is what the Karen are dealing with, what their cousins, their siblings, their brothers, their sisters are still dealing with there. But they came over here and they're absolutely wonderful, wonderful people. And again, it's like, you can recognize, you can say that out loud. You can say these are amazing people. They went through something horrible. But also we don't want to necessarily, I don't want to hear about the 82nd Airborne jumping into the Myanmar airfields. We don't want that either.
No. And that's, it doesn't have to be
It's
sort
not
of
a
an all or
binary
nothing.
choice.
Yeah.
There
is other ways that we can support communities that do need it and that are a benefit to American interests. And I think that message has been lost, the importance of soft power, and that's, I think, being looked at as some sort of weakness and waste of money, and it's just not. And I can communicate that very bluntly. I think that
you've seen it firsthand.
And sure. USAID. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of things that need to be cleaned up. I'm certainly not saying that. There's an awful lot of waste. There's middlemen stealing money. There's a whole bunch of that happening. I do, but I don't believe in just ripping the funding away.
You've been to the refugee camps. You've been to the places. You've seen the end user.
We're so lucky to live in a country that you're not going to die of malaria here. Whereas, you go to sub-Saharan Africa and you're going to be prepared to get malaria 3 times a year and be lucky maybe, to get through it each time. But especially when you strip away drugs, which in the scheme of things aren't a lot of money, and compared to
as much as the pharmaceutical companies try.
Sure, as much as, there's an awful lot of waste on other crap here. When do we lose the value of human life? And if anything, when do we lose the value of a child's life? If we're not, who are we if we're not willing to stand up for the most vulnerable in our population, the children, the elderly, the disabled? What kind of men and women do we want to call ourselves?
And that's where, like, for me on that front, that's where I look at like my own faith in being a Christian. And I definitely feel that at its core, to be a Christian is not to there's a lot of things that I don't want to alienate people here. There's a lot of things that people say being a Christian is, but at its core, what I believe it is to live like Jesus Christ, who's a very caring, empathetic person who did look out for the small person. And if you're living that way, you're caring for the little person. You're selfless. That to me is what being a Christian means. And so for me, it's less about being an American that I care about the people that are impacted in this way, and more about me as a Christian. And how I see myself in the context of my own faith is that if I don't care about kids, women, ethnic minorities that are getting the absolute worst effects of what humans can do to each other, if I don't care about them, then how can I in good faith say that I am a Christian, that I am living in the ideals of Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make this into like a sermon or anything, but it's important to me in the way that I look at that, like empathy is a part of that.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing.
Yeah. And I don't know how we're justifying, I guess, I don't know how right now we're sort of in a situation where it's justified in some way to kind of look at people from other countries as sort of subhuman in some way. And I can't get my head around how we can. Yeah.
This is why travel is so important, because it's a lot harder to hate or disenfranchise people that you've like met in real life before when you've seen a place. Like you have a bunch of people that, insert any country that you've been to, right? Where you're like, hey, I probably wouldn't recommend you go on like a family vacation there, but the people are actually really wonderful. Yeah. They're amazing people. And I'm glad that I have the context of knowing that there's beautiful, amazing people in these areas that happen to be going through a period of war.
Yeah.
Through many reasons, no fault of their own. And you know that because you've traveled all over the world. You've been to all these different places. And so when somebody says, oh, this place sucks or these people suck, you're like, well, I don't know. I've been there. They didn't. They were actually really awesome. And somebody invited me into their home and fed me and gave me a place to sleep. And, and I'm completely out of my element. And like, that's a real thing. But a lot of people have never left their home, like their home state.
Yeah. Never
mind gone to a different country. Not everybody can. Would it be entirely good for the world if Americans started mass vacationing all over the place? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm still a proponent of seeing the world, no matter where you're from. Yeah.
How did you end up? I feel like I'm dragging this on here, but you're a fascinating person, Holly. How did you make the decision yourself to you grew up in Australia and, make this decision to come to America and take a chance on, I assume pursuing some dreams here that
I really wasn't pursuing a journalism career at all.
Well, what brought you over then?
Yeah. So I was studying. So I grew up actually as a full-time ballerina, and I broke my ankle when I was 18. And so then I ended up going sort of to university, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was always interested in writing, really. I loved writing and the creative world, I guess, media creative world, not in the news side of things necessarily. I wasn't what you would consider to be a news junkie. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. And then, had worked a lot professionally in Australia. And I guess, I was about 20 and was finishing my degree and just sort of last minute thought, well, I'd saved up all this money from working and from dancing, commercials, that sort of thing. And then thought, well, I'm just going to go finish my degree. And my university in Sydney was affiliated with a university in New York. So I thought, well, I'm going to go do it. I've got the money. I've got, this is the right time to do it. And it was a bit of a, I guess, split decision. So I applied for that program and was accepted. And basically, I just kind of got up and left it. I didn't have any grand ambitions other than I was going to spend 6 months in New York. And then I got to New York and, was still doing a lot of my ballet, and I was not sure where I was going with my life, really.
So much of this, so much of your life makes so much more sense to me now. No, the context of you were a ballerina, because I think of ballerinas as tough as nails. Like you've already been through some shit as a ballerina. And so you just kind of going to a war zone is
a piece of cake.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure, and I was sort of offered some ballet work, and then randomly ended up getting this internship. And this was really early, I guess, in .com days. So a lot of people still, when I wanted to be broadcast journalists kind of thing, is I didn't have a huge amount of interest in that. I didn't want to be on camera necessarily. I didn't feel comfortable with that. And I didn't want, I wanted to write if I was going to do anything. And so I'd had some web coding experience a little bit that I taught myself. And so I kind of got chucked into the early digital.com era, which was great because then I was kind of the only intern. So that means you really got to do a lot and be out there and writing. And whereas I think if you're in the broadcast side, you're one of like 6 or 7 maybe on a show, and you don't really get the chance to stand out or prove yourself. So that was really a blessing. And then I ended up getting offered a sponsorship at the end of that. And then, just basically said, we want to build up the Los Angeles bureau, and will you go to LA? And I was sort of course. And so that was like, I guess I hustled a little bit, but I was in the right place at the right time and worked really hard, kind of went above and beyond. And I don't know that those opportunities would happen to a 20-year-old today. But was very lucky to have this opportunity. And so I kind of went with it, even though I never necessarily envisioned a journalism career, but that's what came to me. So I think I've always felt very lucky, and I've worked very hard, obviously, in my life. Nothing's been handed to me. I'm certainly not any Nepo baby, but I've worked very hard, but I feel blessed in that, I've managed to meet the right people, I think, along the way, and managed to just, I guess, know what I want enough to open those doors as they come, and then it maybe gets a little harder as you get older because you're not quite sure what you want. But I very much embrace the flow of life, and trying to evolve and grow as a person and grow in my career, and just I guess accepting different challenges as they approach.
What a great way to approach life. Just take them as they come and do your best.
Yeah, I think there's so much. There's so much sort of hustle and fighting involved, and I think you have to do that to a large degree. And then there is a point, I think, where you let go, and that's, I guess, the point that I'm at is letting go. And maybe I'm not always in a place that I thought that I would be at my age, but just having gratitude for what you've already experienced, what you are yet to experience, and I think just being a lot more present is really my goal. Instead of always planning the next trip, the next place, the next, there's something really lovely just about being where you are and not thinking 25 steps ahead.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, Hollie, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me anytime.
Yeah, and you publish a lot of your work on, you've got your own Substack.
Yes.
We'll make sure that we link to that. And you've got a few different books. And I am ashamed to say I've not read any of them. I've read a lot of your work, but it's always been your stories.
Thank you.
But we'll make sure we leave some links for that and everything. And I look forward to whatever the next story is. You said you're working on a manuscript. I can't wait to read the book.
Yes. So that's actually, that's been a long one coming, and something I'm very close to, and something I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of that one.
Can you say it? Do you know the title yet?
Well, the title might change, but it's looking at mothers in war. And so I think there's 12 different countries around the world that I've covered. And just, these incredible sort of experiences of very much the unsung heroes that we don't see, that you probably aren't necessarily going to read about in any kind of flashing headline news, but stories that will really, I think, blow your mind.
I can't wait. Thanks, Hollie.
Thanks.